Grizzly bear attacks wedding party, 11 injured, October 12, 2024. The morning of October 12, 2024 dawned crisp and clear over Jackson Hole, Wyoming, with temperatures hovering at 38 degrees Fahrenheit and not a cloud visible in the crystalline blue sky that stretched endlessly above the Teton Range. The aspens had reached their peak golden splendor, their leaves shimmering like thousands of coins in the gentle morning breeze that carried the scent of pine, sage, and the faint musk of wildlife that permeated the valley during autumn. For Natalie Marie Peters, 28 years old and radiant with the particular glow that comes to brides on their wedding day, this was to be the culmination of 18 months of meticulous planning, dreams realized, and the beginning of her new life with Michael James Harrison, 31, a wildlife photographer whose work had taken him to the most remote corners of North America, but who had found his greatest adventure in falling in love with the auburn-haired emergency room nurse from Denver, who had captured his heart during a chance encounter at Rocky Mountain National Park 2 years prior. Natalie had awakened at 5:30 in the morning in the master bedroom of the Rustic Ridge Lodge, a luxury cabin rental facility located approximately 14 miles northeast of Jackson along the Snake River, her heart racing not with anxiety, but with pure, unbridled excitement. The lodge, constructed of massive Douglas fir logs and featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the Grand Tetons, had been reserved for the entire wedding party since Wednesday, October 9th. Allowing the closest family and friends to experience what Natalie had described in her planning notes as an immersive Wyoming wilderness experience that celebrates our love for the outdoors and each other. The 4,200-square-foot main lodge could accommodate up to 16 guests in its 8 bedrooms, while 2 additional guest cabins on the property provided space for another 12 people, creating an intimate compound where the wedding party could prepare, celebrate, and create memories surrounded by some of the most spectacular scenery in North America. The property itself sat on 47 acres of pristine wilderness, bordered on the north by Bridger Teton National Forest, and on the west by a tributary of the Snake River that meandered through stands of cottonwood, aspen, and blue spruce before joining the main river channel approximately 2 miles downstream. The elevation of 7,200 feet provided stunning vistas while remaining accessible to guests of varying physical capabilities, though the remoteness of the location meant that the nearest emergency services were stationed in Jackson, a 23-minute drive under optimal conditions along winding mountain roads that could become treacherous in inclement weather. Natalie's father, Robert William Peters, 56 years old, and a recently retired petroleum engineer from Houston, had spared no expense in making his daughter's dream wedding a reality. Having sold his consulting firm 6 months earlier for what he described to close friends as enough money to ensure Natalie never has to worry about anything, Robert had embraced the role of father of the bride with characteristic determination and attention to detail. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with silver hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades spent on oil rigs and construction sites before transitioning to the corporate world, Robert possessed an engineer's methodical approach to problem solving and had applied those same skills to wedding planning with remarkable results. The guest list had been carefully curated to include only the most important people in Natalie and Michael's lives, totaling 63 individuals who had traveled from across the country to witness the ceremony. Among them were Michael's parents, Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, a veterinarian from Bozeman, Montana, and James Harrison Sr., a retired Forest Service ranger whose 38 years of experience in wilderness management had instilled in his son both a deep respect for nature and an understanding of its inherent dangers. Michael's sister, Sarah Elizabeth Harrison Martinez, 34, had arrived from Albuquerque with her husband Carlos and their twin 8-year-old daughters, while his younger brother David, 27, and recently graduated from veterinary school, had driven up from Fort Collins with his girlfriend of 2 years, Rebecca Chen, a graduate student in wildlife biology at Colorado State University. Natalie's side of the family was equally well represented, including her mother, Patricia Lynn Peters, 54, a high school principal from Houston who had coordinated the travel arrangements for numerous extended family members, and her brother Thomas, 31, a commercial airline pilot based in Denver who had taken a week of vacation time to serve as one of Michael's groomsmen. Thomas had brought his wife Jennifer and their 4-year-old son Tyler, while Natalie's closest friends from nursing school had arrived from various cities across Texas and Colorado, including her maid of honor, Amanda Rose Thompson, 29, a pediatric nurse practitioner from Dallas, whose infectious laugh and unwavering loyalty had sustained Natalie through the most challenging periods of her nursing career and romantic life. The wedding ceremony itself had been planned for 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a natural meadow approximately 300 yards southeast of the main lodge, where a temporary altar constructed of native stone and decorated with locally sourced wildflowers would provide the backdrop for their vows. The reception was scheduled to begin at 6:30, immediately following a cocktail hour, during which guests would be served locally sourced appetizers and signature cocktails inspired by the couple's travels together, including a whiskey-based drink called Teton Sunset that featured Wyoming honey and fresh sage, and a gin cocktail named Snake River Sparkle that incorporated local juniper berries and elderflower liqueur. The catering for the event had been arranged through Jackson Hole Gourmet, owned and operated by chef Isabella Rodriguez, 43, a James Beard Award nominee who had relocated to Wyoming from San Francisco 5 years earlier, seeking what she described as a more authentic connection to the ingredients and landscape that inspire my cooking. Chef Rodriguez had designed a menu that celebrated the flavors of the Mountain West while accommodating various dietary restrictions among the guests, featuring dishes such as bison tenderloin with huckleberry reduction, rainbow trout caught from local streams and prepared with wild mushrooms foraged from the surrounding forests, and roasted root vegetables sourced from organic farms in the Teton Valley. The centerpiece of the reception would be a 3-tier cake created by local baker Margaret Kim, whose business, Sweet Mountain Confections, had gained national recognition for its innovative use of alpine ingredients and stunning presentations that captured the essence of Wyoming's natural beauty. As dawn broke over the Teton Peaks, casting long shadows across the meadows and forests surrounding Rustic Ridge Lodge, the wildlife of the area was beginning its daily routines, largely unnoticed by the human guests who were still sleeping peacefully in their comfortable beds. Approximately 2.5 miles northwest of the lodge, following a game trail that paralleled Grouse Creek before ascending toward the ridgeline that separated the Snake River drainage from the Buffalo Fork watershed, a massive male grizzly bear was concluding what had been a particularly successful night of foraging in preparation for the approaching winter hibernation period. The bear, estimated by wildlife biologists who would later examine the evidence to be approximately 12 years old and weighing between 7 and 8 pounds, 100 and 750 pounds, stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder and measured close to 8 feet from nose to tail. His coat, now thick and lustrous in preparation for winter, displayed the characteristic silver-tipped guard hairs that gave grizzly bears their distinctive appearance, while his massive head and pronounced shoulder hump marked him unmistakably as a mature boar in his prime. His tracks, discovered later by investigators, measured 11.5 inches in length and nearly 9 inches in width, with claw marks extending an additional 4 inches beyond the toe pads, creating impressions in the soft earth that spoke to the immense power contained within his massive frame. This particular bear, designated as Bear 411 in the Wyoming game, and Fish Department's database following a brief capture and collar placement operation conducted 3 years earlier, had established a territory encompassing approximately 200 square miles of prime grizzly habitat stretching from the Gros Ventre Wilderness in the east to the boundaries of Grand Teton National Park in the west. Radio telemetry data collected during the 18 months he wore, the GPS collar had revealed a complex pattern of seasonal movements that demonstrated his intimate knowledge of the landscape and its resources, from high alpine meadows where he grazed on grass and forbs during the spring and early summer, to lower elevation areas where he could access spawning cutthroat trout, ungulate carcasses, and the rich variety of berries and nuts that formed the foundation of his autumn hyperphagia, the intensive feeding period that would allow him to accumulate the fat reserves necessary for surviving the winter months in his den. The removal of Bear 411's collar in late 2023, a routine procedure designed to prevent injury as the bear continued to grow, had left wildlife managers with less detailed information about his movements and behavior patterns, though occasional sightings reported by hikers, hunters, and local residents suggested that he remained within his established territory and continued to exhibit the generally reclusive behavior typical of adult male grizzlies. However, the exceptional drought conditions that had persisted throughout much of 2024 had significantly impacted the availability of natural food sources across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, forcing bears to range more widely and work harder to locate the calories they needed for winter preparation. The white bark pine nuts that typically formed a crucial component of grizzly bear diets during autumn had failed almost completely due to a combination of prolonged dry conditions and an outbreak of mountain pine beetles that had decimated high-elevation pine forests across the region. Huckleberries, another critical food source, had produced a crop estimated at less than 30% of normal levels, while the spawning runs of native cutthroat trout had been severely diminished by low water levels in streams and rivers throughout the ecosystem. These factors had combined to create what wildlife biologists termed a food stress year that increased the likelihood of bear-human conflicts as animals desperately sought alternative food sources and expanded their foraging ranges into areas where they might encounter human activity. On the evening of October 11th, Bear 411 had detected an unusual concentration of odors drifting on the wind from the direction of Rustic Ridge Lodge, where the wedding party had gathered for a rehearsal dinner that featured an outdoor barbecue prepared by the catering staff. The complex mixture of grilled meats, cooking oils, and food scraps had created an olfactory beacon that could be detected by a bear's extraordinarily sensitive nose from distances of several miles, particularly when atmospheric conditions were favorable for scent dispersal. Grizzly bears possess a sense of smell that is estimated to be 7 times more acute than that of a bloodhound, with some experts suggesting they can detect odors at concentrations as low as parts per billion, making them extraordinarily effective at locating food sources across vast landscapes. The bear had spent the early evening hours of October 11th investigating the perimeter of the lodge property, staying well within the forest cover that bordered the cleared areas around the buildings while gathering information about the human activity taking place there. His investigation revealed not only the presence of large quantities of food, but also patterns of human behavior that suggested a temporary concentration of activity rather than the permanent occupation that might pose a greater threat to his safety. The absence of guard dogs, the relatively small number of vehicles, and the periodic absence of humans from outdoor areas all contributed to an assessment that the lodge represented a low-risk, high-reward opportunity for supplementing his caloric intake during this critical period of pre-hibernation feeding. Throughout the night of October 11th, Bear 411 had maintained surveillance of the lodge area from a position approximately 400 yards to the northwest, where a dense thicket of serviceberry and chokecherry bushes provided excellent concealment while offering clear sightlines to the human activity below. His patient observation had revealed the routines and movements of the lodge occupants, including the times when outdoor areas were most and least active, the locations where food preparation and consumption took place, and the general patterns of human behavior that would inform his decision-making process as he evaluated the potential risks and benefits of a closer approach to the property. As the first light of October 12th began to illuminate the peaks of the Teton Range, painting the snow-covered summits in shades of gold and rose, the residents of Rustic Ridge Lodge were beginning to stir in anticipation of what they expected to be one of the most memorable days of their lives. In the master bedroom of the main lodge, Natalie Peters sat at an antique vanity table, carefully applying the foundation that would serve as the base for her wedding day makeup, her reflection in the mirror revealing eyes bright with excitement and just a hint of the nervous energy that accompanies all major life transitions. She had chosen to wake early specifically to enjoy these quiet moments before the controlled chaos of wedding day preparations began in earnest, knowing that once her bridesmaids arrived for the traditional getting-ready activities, her time would no longer be her own until after the ceremony concluded, and she and Michael could finally steal away for a few private moments as husband and wife. The sounds of the lodge awakening drifted through the log walls and windows, the gentle hiss of coffee brewing in the kitchen below, the muffled voices of early risers discussing the day's weather forecast and schedule, and the occasional creak of floorboards as people moved about their rooms, preparing for the day ahead. Outside, the morning air carried the calls of mountain birds beginning their daily activities, the distant splash of the river as it flowed over rocks and fallen logs, and the subtle rustling of aspen leaves that had reached their peak autumn color and would soon begin their annual descent to the forest floor. In a guest room on the lodge's second floor, Michael Harrison stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting the collar of the white dress shirt he had chosen to wear beneath his charcoal grey suit, a garment he had selected specifically because its color would complement both the natural setting and Natalie's ivory wedding dress. His hands, normally steady whether operating a camera in challenging conditions or navigating treacherous terrain in pursuit of the perfect wildlife photograph, trembled slightly as he worked with the collar buttons, a physical manifestation of the emotions that coursed through him as he prepared to marry the woman who had transformed his understanding of what it meant to share a life with another person. Michael's professional work as a wildlife photographer had taken him to some of the most remote and dangerous places on Earth. From the Arctic tundra, where he had documented the effects of climate change on polar bear populations, to the dense rainforests of Southeast Asia, where he had spent weeks tracking elusive leopards through terrain that tested every survival skill he had learned during his years in the wilderness. His portfolio included images that had been published in National Geographic, Smithsonian Magazine, and Outdoor Photography, while his book Silent Hunters, Predators of the North American Wilderness had won the prestigious Ansel Adams Award for Excellence in Nature Photography and established him as one of the leading wildlife photographers of his generation. Despite his extensive experience in the field and his deep knowledge of animal behavior, Michael shared the common human tendency to view wildlife encounters through the lens of his professional experience rather than as immediate personal threats. His years of photographing bears, wolves, mountain lions, and other potentially dangerous animals had given him confidence in his ability to read animal behavior and respond appropriately to various situations. But this professional confidence also carried with it a subtle complacency that could prove dangerous when circumstances deviated from expected patterns or when animals behaved in ways that fell outside the normal parameters of his experience. The wedding party's collective experience with wildlife reflected the typical urban and suburban backgrounds of most of the guests, few of whom had extensive knowledge of bear behavior or wilderness safety protocols, despite their enthusiasm for the outdoor setting of the celebration. Robert Peters, despite his engineering background and practical approach to problem-solving, had focused his pre-wedding research on logistical concerns such as catering arrangements, transportation coordination, and weather contingency planning, rather than wildlife safety considerations, operating under the assumption that the lodge's professional management would have addressed any potential hazards associated with the remote location. The lodge staff, consisting of property manager David Chen, maintenance supervisor Maria Santos, and catering coordinator Jennifer Walsh, had indeed followed standard protocols for wildlife management in bear country, including the use of bear-resistant garbage containers, proper food storage procedures, and regular inspection of the property for signs of animal activity. However, these measures were designed primarily to prevent routine encounters with wildlife, rather than to deter a large, determined predator operating under the stress of food scarcity and approaching winter conditions. Property manager David Chen, 38 years old and a Jackson Hole resident for the past 12 years, had worked in the hospitality industry throughout the greater Yellowstone region and possessed considerable knowledge of local wildlife patterns and safety procedures. His background included 5 years as a backcountry guide for Jackson Hole Mountain Resort and 3 years with the Teton County Sheriff's Office Search and Rescue Team, experiences that had given him practical knowledge of bear behavior and wilderness emergency response protocols. However, Chen's responsibilities during the wedding weekend were focused primarily on ensuring the comfort and satisfaction of the guests rather than conducting detailed wildlife monitoring, and his pre-event safety briefing had covered only basic precautions, such as proper food storage and the importance of maintaining clean outdoor areas. The catering team, led by Chef Isabella Rodriguez and including sous chef Marcus Thompson and servers Angela Miller and Josh Roberts, had arrived at the lodge on the morning of October 12th at 6:30 to begin preparation for the day's events. Their activities included transporting equipment and ingredients from their base in Jackson, setting up temporary cooking stations in the lodge's kitchen, and preparing the outdoor reception area where guests would dine under the stars following the ceremony. The complexity of serving a formal dinner for 63 guests in a remote location required extensive logistical planning and coordination, including the use of portable refrigeration units, backup power generation, and carefully timed food preparation that would ensure optimal quality and safety throughout the evening. Chef Rodriguez had designed the reception menu with particular attention to utilizing local ingredients and showcasing the flavors of the region, but her focus on culinary excellence had not extended to consideration of how the concentration of food odors might impact local wildlife behavior. The bison tenderloin that would serve as the evening's main course had been delivered to the lodge the previous afternoon and was being aged in a custom-built outdoor smoker that had been installed approximately 50 yards from the main lodge building, while other ingredients, including fresh herbs, vegetables, and dairy products, were stored in commercial-grade refrigeration units housed in a temporary structure adjacent to the kitchen. The timeline for October 12th had been meticulously planned to ensure smooth transitions between the various components of the celebration, beginning with breakfast service at 8 o'clock for those guests who wished to fuel up before the busy day ahead. The morning schedule included a group hike to a scenic overlook approximately 1 mile from the lodge for those interested in experiencing more of the local landscape, while others planned to relax around the lodge, enjoy spa services provided by mobile therapists brought in from Jackson, or simply spend time socializing with family and friends in the comfortable common areas of the main building. Natalie's pre-ceremony schedule included a late morning brunch with her bridesmaids, followed by hair and makeup appointments beginning at noon with a team of stylists from Salon Sage in Jackson, who specialized in outdoor wedding beauty services. The photography schedule called for individual portraits of the bride and groom to be completed by 3 o'clock, allowing time for a first look session and couples' portraits before the 4 o'clock ceremony began. Michael had arranged for a colleague, photographer Lisa Chang from Denver, to document the wedding using a combination of traditional portraiture and photojournalistic techniques that would capture both the formal elements of the celebration and the spontaneous moments of joy and connection that made each wedding unique. The ceremony location had been selected for its natural beauty and intimate scale, featuring a grove of mature aspen trees whose golden canopy would provide a stunning backdrop for the exchange of vows while offering some protection from wind and weather. Rustic wooden benches borrowed from a local event rental company would provide seating for guests, while a simple altar constructed of stacked stone and decorated with seasonal wildflowers would serve as the focal point for the ceremony. The site's elevation provided panoramic views of the Teton Range to the west and the Gros Ventre Mountains to the east, creating a sense of being surrounded by the grandeur of the Wyoming wilderness while maintaining easy accessibility from the lodge facilities. As the morning progressed and the various wedding party members began their preparations, the level of activity around the lodge increased steadily, with multiple vehicles arriving to deliver flowers, equipment, and additional catering supplies. The increased human activity, combined with the concentration of food odors emanating from the kitchen and outdoor cooking areas, created an increasingly complex sensory environment that continued to attract the attention of Bear 411, who had spent the early morning hours gradually moving closer to the lodge property while using natural terrain features and vegetation to remain concealed from human observation. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the Bear had established a new observation position approximately 200 yards northwest of the main lodge, where a cluster of large boulders and dense pine trees provided excellent concealment while offering multiple escape routes should retreat become necessary. From this location, he could clearly observe the patterns of human movement around the lodge buildings, monitor the activities of the catering staff as they worked in the outdoor areas, and assess the overall security situation as he continued to evaluate the potential risks and benefits of attempting to access the food sources he had detected. The Bear's behavior during this period reflected the complex decision-making processes that characterize intelligent predators operating in human-dominated landscapes. His approach was methodical and patient, gathering information about human routines and vulnerabilities, while avoiding premature exposure that might result in confrontation or force him to abandon a potentially valuable food source. This behavioral pattern, while rational from the Bear's perspective, created a situation of escalating danger for the wedding party, who remained unaware of his presence and continued their preparations under the assumption that the remote location provided safety from wildlife encounters. At approximately 10:15 in the morning, Bear 411 detected a significant increase in food odors emanating from the outdoor cooking area, where the catering staff was beginning preparation of the appetizers that would be served during the evening cocktail hour. The complex mixture of cooking oils, grilled meats, and seasoning created an olfactory stimulus that triggered powerful instinctive responses related to feeding and caloric intake, responses that became increasingly difficult to suppress as the Bear's hunger continued to build during this critical period of pre-winter preparation. The drought conditions that had persisted throughout the summer and early autumn had forced the Bear to expand considerable energy in searching for food sources that were typically more abundant and accessible during normal years. His body weight, while still substantial, was estimated to be approximately 50 to 70 pounds below the optimal level for entering hibernation, creating a physiological stress that intensified his food-seeking behavior and reduced his natural caution around human activity. Wildlife biologists would later describe this combination of factors as creating a perfect storm scenario that significantly increased the likelihood of aggressive behavior toward any perceived obstacles to accessing needed calories. As the wedding party continued their morning activities, blissfully unaware of the massive predator watching from the forest, the schedule of events proceeded according to plan. Natalie had joined her bridesmaids for a leisurely brunch served on the lodge's wraparound deck, where they enjoyed mimosas made with locally produced sparkling wine and fresh orange juice, while discussing their excitement about the day ahead and sharing memories of their friendships with the bride. The atmosphere was relaxed and joyful, filled with laughter and the kind of easy conversation that characterizes gatherings of people who have known and loved each other for years. Amanda Thompson, serving as maid of honor, had organized a series of surprise gifts for Natalie that reflected their shared experiences and inside jokes accumulated during their friendship, which had begun during their first year of nursing school at the University of Texas at Austin and had sustained them through the challenges of their professional training, early careers, and various romantic relationships. Amanda's gift presentation included a custom photo album documenting their adventures together, a piece of jewelry featuring Natalie's birthstone that could be incorporated into her wedding ensemble, and a heartfelt letter expressing her love and support for her best friend's new journey as a married woman. The other bridesmaids, including Natalie's cousin Rebecca Peters Williams from Austin, college friend Sarah Martinez from Colorado Springs, and work colleague Jennifer Kim from Denver, had also prepared thoughtful gifts and surprises that contributed to the emotional richness of the morning's festivities. The group's conversation ranged from wedding day logistics and timeline coordination to broader discussions about relationships, career aspirations, and the various life changes they had all experienced during their late 20s and early 30s. Meanwhile, Michael and his groomsmen had gathered in the lodge's game room for their own version of pre-wedding celebration, which included a poker game with stakes deliberately kept low to avoid any potential conflicts that might disrupt the day's harmony. The group consisted of Michael's brother David, Natalie's brother Thomas, college friends Marcus Chen from Seattle and Brian O'Connor from Portland, and longtime photography colleague James Rivera from Santa Fe, all of whom had traveled considerable distances to participate in the celebration and were determined to make the weekend memorable for everyone involved. Michael's father, James Harrison Sr., had joined the group, despite not participating in the poker game, preferring to share stories from his years with the Forest Service and offer gentle advice about marriage based on his 41-year relationship with Michael's mother. His tales of wilderness adventures, wildlife encounters, and the challenges of balancing career demands with family responsibilities provided a rich backdrop for the morning's conversation, while subtly reinforcing themes about the importance of mutual support, communication, and shared values in building successful long-term relationships. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, Michael's mother, had spent the morning coordinating with the photographer and videographer to ensure that all the important family moments would be properly documented, while also serving as an informal advisor to various family members who had questions about the day's schedule or needed assistance with their preparations. Her professional background as a veterinarian had given her extensive knowledge of animal behavior and wilderness safety, but like most of the wedding party, she was focused on the human dimensions of the celebration rather than potential wildlife hazards. As the morning transitioned into afternoon, The pace of activity around the lodge increased significantly as various vendors arrived to complete their setup procedures and wedding party members began the more intensive aspects of their personal preparations. Hairstylist Maria Gonzalez and makeup artist Ashley Park had established their temporary salon in one of the lodge's guest bedrooms, where they would spend the next several hours transforming Natalie and her bridesmaids into their wedding day looks using techniques and products specifically selected for outdoor photography and mountain weather conditions. The floral arrangements, designed and created by Jackson Hole florists under the direction of owner Susan Miller, began arriving at noon and included everything from Natalie's bridal bouquet featuring white roses, eucalyptus, and seasonal berries, to the centerpieces that would grace the reception tables and the ceremonial arrangements that would decorate the outdoor altar. The flowers had been selected for their ability to withstand outdoor conditions while maintaining their beauty throughout the day and evening, with particular attention paid to choosing varieties that would photograph well under various lighting conditions and complement the natural setting of the celebration. Photographer Lisa Chang had begun her documentation of the day's events with detail shots of the bridal preparations, capturing images of Natalie's dress hanging in the window of the master bedroom, the carefully arranged accessories and jewelry that would complete her ensemble, and the various gifts and mementos that reflected the emotional significance of the occasion. Her approach emphasized both the formal portraits that would become family heirlooms and the candid moments that revealed the genuine emotions and relationships that made this particular wedding unique. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Bear 411 had moved even closer to the lodge property, taking advantage of the increased human activity and associated noise to mask his approach while the occupants were distracted by their various preparations. His new position, located behind a large utility shed approximately 150 yards from the main lodge building, provided him with detailed observation of the outdoor areas where food preparation was taking place, while offering multiple escape routes through the dense forest that bordered the property on 3 sides. The bear's proximity to the human activity represented a significant escalation in the potential danger facing the wedding party, though his presence remained undetected despite his substantial size and the obvious signs his movement had left in the soft forest soil. His tracks, clearly visible to anyone with basic knowledge of wildlife sign, marked a path of steady approach that had brought him progressively closer to the center of human activity throughout the morning hours. But the wedding party's focus on their preparations and celebrations had prevented anyone from conducting the kind of routine security sweep that might have revealed his presence. The catering staff, working under the pressure of preparing a complex meal for a large group in a remote location, had been particularly focused on their professional responsibilities rather than monitoring for wildlife activity. Their outdoor work area, established adjacent to the lodge's kitchen for efficiency and convenience, had generated a continuous stream of food odors throughout the morning as they prepared various components of the evening's menu, creating an increasingly powerful attractant for any wildlife in the area while the staff remained unaware of the potential consequences of their activities. Chef Isabella Rodriguez, despite her 5 years of experience cooking in Wyoming's wilderness settings, had become somewhat complacent about wildlife precautions due to the rarity of serious encounters during her previous events and the assumption that the lodge's professional management would have implemented appropriate safety measures. Her focus was entirely on culinary excellence and client satisfaction, with wildlife safety relegated to the background of her consciousness as she coordinated the complex logistics of outdoor fine dining service. The afternoon photography schedule called for Michael and Natalie to meet for their first look session at 2:30, a modern wedding tradition that allows couples to see each other before the ceremony in a controlled, private setting that can be documented by their photographer. The location chosen for this intimate moment was a meadow approximately 200 yards southeast of the lodge, where the natural beauty of the landscape would provide a stunning backdrop for photographs, while offering the privacy needed for the emotional exchange between bride and groom. As 2:30 approached and the first look session was about to begin, Bear 411 made the decision to investigate more closely the source of the food odors that had been attracting his attention throughout the day. His movement toward the lodge buildings represented a critical escalation in the developing situation, though his approach remained methodical and cautious as he used available cover to minimize the risk of detection while maximizing his opportunity to assess the food sources and security situation. The bear's route took him along the edge of the forest that bordered the lodge property, staying within the tree line while moving steadily toward the outdoor cooking area where the catering staff was working. His massive size and powerful build allowed him to move with surprising stealth through the undergrowth, his padded feet making minimal noise on the forest floor despite his substantial weight, while his dark coloration provided effective camouflage against the shadows of the pine and aspen trees that surrounded the property. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, as photographer Lisa Chang was positioning Michael for the first look session and Natalie was making her final approach along the designated path, Bear 411 reached the perimeter of the cleared area surrounding the lodge buildings. From his position behind a large pine tree approximately 75 yards from the outdoor cooking station, he could clearly observe the activities of the catering staff and assess the security situation that would determine his next course of action. The bear's assessment of the situation revealed several factors that suggested a low-risk opportunity for accessing the food sources he had detected. The human activity appeared to be concentrated in specific areas, leaving large portions of the property temporarily unguarded, while the noise and distraction associated with the wedding preparations had reduced the likelihood that his approach would be immediately detected. Most significantly, the abundance of food odors indicated a concentration of caloric resources that could provide substantial nutritional benefit with relatively minimal risk compared to other foraging opportunities available in his territory. The first look session between Michael and Natalie proceeded according to schedule, with photographer Lisa Chang capturing the emotional moment when the groom first saw his bride in her wedding dress. The ivory silk gown, designed by a boutique in Denver and altered specifically for Natalie's petite frame, featured intricate beadwork and flowing lines that complemented both her figure and the natural setting of the celebration. Michael's reaction, a combination of joy, awe, and barely contained emotion, provided the photographer with exactly the kind of authentic moment that would become a treasured memory for the couple and their families. The photography session expanded to include formal portraits of the couple against various backdrops around the lodge property, with particular attention paid to capturing images that showcase both their obvious happiness and the stunning natural beauty of the Wyoming wilderness that had inspired their choice of venue. The golden afternoon light, filtering through the aspen leaves and casting a warm glow across the landscape, created ideal conditions for outdoor portraiture, while the mild temperatures and calm winds made the session comfortable for both subjects and photographer. As the formal photography session continued, the various other components of the wedding day timeline proceeded simultaneously. The ceremony site was receiving its final decorations, with floral arrangements being positioned around the altar area and sound equipment being tested to ensure that all guests would be able to hear the exchange of vows, clearly despite the outdoor setting. The reception area was also taking shape, with tables and chairs being arranged according to the seating chart that Natalie and Robert Peters had developed after careful consideration of family dynamics and social relationships among the guests. The catering staff had expanded their outdoor work area to accommodate the final phases of meal preparation, including the setup of serving stations and the arrangement of equipment needed for the evening's dining service. Their activities generated increasingly concentrated food odors as multiple dishes were prepared simultaneously, creating an olfactory environment that intensified Bear 411's interest while continuing to mask the signs of his presence from the distracted wedding party. At 3:15 in the afternoon, approximately 30 minutes before the scheduled start of the wedding ceremony, Bear 411 made his final approach to the lodge property. His movement from the forest edge to a position behind the utility shed that housed backup generators and maintenance equipment brought him within 100 yards of the main concentration of human activity, close enough to launch a rapid approach to the food sources while still maintaining some concealment from immediate observation. The bear's behavior during this final approach phase reflected the complex risk-benefit analysis that characterizes large predator decision-making in human-modified environments. His assessment had concluded that the potential nutritional rewards outweighed the perceived risks, particularly given the apparent distraction of the human occupants and the abundance of escape routes available should retreat become necessary. This calculated approach, while rational from the bear's perspective, created an extremely dangerous situation for the wedding party, who remained completely unaware of the massive predator positioning himself within striking distance of their celebration. The timing of the bear's final approach coincided with the period of maximum activity and distraction among the wedding party as they prepared for the ceremony to begin. Guests were making final adjustments to their appearance, finding their designated seats, and engaging in the social interactions that characterize pre-ceremony gathering, while the bride and groom were completing their photography session and preparing for their entrance. The combination of excitement, nervous energy, and focused attention on the upcoming ceremony created an environment in which routine security awareness was significantly diminished, leaving the group vulnerable to the threat that was developing just beyond their immediate awareness. Wedding coordinator Jennifer Walsh, a Jackson Hole resident with extensive experience managing outdoor events, had arrived at 3 o'clock to oversee the final preparation phase and ensure smooth execution of the ceremony timeline. Her responsibilities included coordinating the various vendors, managing the logistics of guest seating and processional organization, and troubleshooting any last-minute issues that might arise. However, her focus was entirely on the human elements of the event rather than environmental monitoring, and her pre-event safety briefing had addressed only basic outdoor precautions rather than wildlife awareness protocols. The string quartet that would provide music for the ceremony, consisting of professional musicians from the Jackson Symphony Orchestra, had completed their setup and sound check by 3:20, with their performance area positioned to provide optimal acoustics for the outdoor venue while remaining unobtrusive to the visual elements of the ceremony. The musical selections, chosen by Natalie and Michael to reflect both their personal tastes and the natural setting of their wedding, included classical pieces by composers such as Vivaldi and Pachelbel, as well as contemporary arrangements of songs that held special meaning in their relationship. As 3:30 approached and the ceremony start time drew near, the various elements of the wedding celebration were converging according to plan, with guests beginning to take their seats, vendors completing their final preparations, and the bride and groom making ready for their entrance. The atmosphere was filled with anticipation and joy as family and friends gathered to witness this important milestone in Natalie and Michael's lives, creating memories that they expected would be cherished for decades to come. However, the developing situation with Bear 411 represented a threat that none of the celebration participants had anticipated or prepared for, despite the remote location and known wildlife habitat that surrounded the lodge property. The bear's patient approach and methodical assessment of the situation had brought him to within striking distance of the human activity, while his presence remained completely undetected, creating the potential for a catastrophic encounter that could transform this joyful celebration into a scene of terror and tragedy. At 3:45 in the afternoon, 15 minutes before the scheduled ceremony start time, Bear 411 emerged from behind the utility shed and began moving directly toward the outdoor catering area, where the evening's dinner preparations were reaching their final stages. His movement was deliberate and confident, reflecting his assessment that the human activity posed minimal immediate threat to his safety, while the concentration of food sources warranted the risk of closer approach. The bear's massive size and powerful build were now fully visible to anyone who might happen to look in his direction, though the wedding party's attention remained focused on ceremony preparations rather than environmental monitoring. Chef Isabella Rodriguez was the first human to become aware of the bear's presence when she glanced up from her preparation work at 3:47 and saw the massive animal approaching her outdoor kitchen area from a distance of approximately 50 yards. Her initial reaction was one of disbelief, rather than immediate alarm, as her brain struggled to process the incongruity of seeing such a large, wild animal in close proximity to human activity during what should have been a routine catering event. The chef's professional training in high-stress kitchen environments enabled her to maintain composure even as adrenaline began flooding her system in response to the unprecedented situation she was facing. Her first priority was alerting her staff members to the developing emergency while avoiding any sudden movements or loud sounds that might trigger aggressive behavior from the approaching predator. In a carefully controlled voice, she called quietly to sous chef Marcus Thompson and servers Angela Miller and Josh Roberts, directing them to slowly back away from the food preparation area while avoiding direct eye contact with the bear. The catering staff's response to Chef Rodriguez's warning demonstrated the kind of professional coordination that develops among teams accustomed to working together under pressure, though none of them had previously encountered a situation that required wilderness survival skills rather than culinary expertise. Marcus Thompson, 34 years old and a veteran of high-end restaurant kitchens in San Francisco and Denver, had some limited experience with wildlife from camping trips in Colorado's mountains, but nothing that had prepared him for a close encounter with a mature grizzly bear in a situation where retreat options were limited by the presence of expensive equipment and dozens of potential victims. Angela Miller, 26 and relatively new to the catering industry after completing culinary school in Phoenix, had virtually no experience with wildlife encounters and found herself relying entirely on the guidance of her more experienced colleagues while fighting the panic response that threatened to overwhelm her ability to think clearly and respond appropriately to the crisis. Her training had emphasized food safety, customer service, and kitchen efficiency rather than emergency response protocols, leaving her unprepared for a situation that required wilderness survival instincts rather than hospitality industry skills. Josh Roberts, 28, and a Jackson Hole native whose childhood had included considerable exposure to wildlife through hunting and camping activities with his family, possessed the most relevant background for assessing the bear's behavior and determining appropriate response strategies. His immediate recognition of the animal as a mature male grizzly, combined with his understanding of bear behavior during autumn feeding periods, enabled him to grasp both the immediate danger facing the catering staff and the potential for catastrophic escalation if the situation was not managed carefully. The bear's approach to the catering area proceeded steadily despite the presence of humans, indicating a level of determination that suggested strong motivation related to food acquisition rather than territorial defense or protective behavior. His body language, characterized by forward movement with head down and focused attention on the food preparation area, reflected the kind of single-minded pursuit that often characterizes large predators when they have identified a high-value food source that appears accessible with acceptable risk. As Bear 411 reached the perimeter of the outdoor kitchen area at approximately 3:49, the wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin in 11 minutes, with guests seated and waiting for the processional to commence. The ceremony site, located approximately 300 yards from the catering area, remained unaware of the developing emergency as the string quartet began their prelude. Music and wedding coordinator Jennifer Walsh made final preparations for the bride's entrance. The Bear's investigation of the catering area began with a systematic examination of the food preparation surfaces, where his extraordinarily sensitive nose could detect the complex layering of odors that had been accumulating throughout the day's cooking activities. His massive head moved methodically across the work surface, sampling the olfactory information that would help him locate the most concentrated sources of calories, while assessing the immediate environment for threats and opportunities. Chef Rodriguez and her staff had retreated approximately 20 feet from their work area, but remained close enough to observe the Bear's behavior while maintaining access to their equipment and the means of communication with the wedding party. The chef's professional instincts warred with her survival instincts as she watched months of planning and thousands of dollars worth of food being investigated by a 700-pound predator whose intentions remained unclear and whose behavior could not be predicted based on her limited experience with wildlife encounters. The Bear's initial investigation of the catering area focused primarily on the food preparation surfaces and storage containers, where his powerful claws and teeth enabled him to access items that had been secured against normal environmental hazards but were inadequate barriers against a determined grizzly bear. His consumption of accessible food items was methodical and efficient, reflecting the feeding behavior of an animal that had learned to maximize caloric intake during limited opportunities while remaining alert to potential threats or changes in the security situation. At 3:52, as the Bear continued his investigation of the catering area, wedding coordinator Jennifer Walsh received an urgent radio communication from property manager David Chen, who had been alerted to the situation by Josh Roberts using a cell phone call that managed to connect despite the area's marginal cellular service. Chen's message was brief but clear. A large grizzly bear was actively feeding in the catering area and posed an immediate threat to the safety of everyone on the property. The wedding coordinator's response to this unprecedented emergency demonstrated both professional composure and practical decision-making skills developed through years of managing outdoor events in challenging environments. Her immediate priorities included halting the ceremony proceedings, alerting the efficient and key family members to the developing situation, and coordinating with property management to implement appropriate safety protocols, while avoiding actions that might escalate the bear's aggressive potential. Jennifer Walsh's announcement to the ceremony participants was carefully calibrated to convey the urgency of the situation, while avoiding panic that could lead to dangerous decisions or actions. Speaking in a calm but authoritative voice that carried clearly to the assembled guests, she explained that wildlife activity in the area required an immediate and orderly relocation to the interior of the main lodge building, where everyone would be safe while appropriate authorities were contacted to address the situation. The guests' reaction to this unexpected development reflected the wide range of backgrounds and experience levels represented among the wedding party, from urban residents who had limited exposure to wildlife to outdoor enthusiasts who understood the serious nature of bear encounters in wilderness settings. Some guests responded with curiosity rather than concern, viewing the situation as an interesting addition to their Wyoming wilderness experience, while others immediately grasped the potential danger and began moving quickly toward the safety of the lodge building. Michael Harrison's response to the emergency announcement reflected both his professional experience as a wildlife photographer and his personal responsibility as the groom whose wedding celebration had created the circumstances that brought so many people into potential danger. His immediate instinct was to assess the situation personally and potentially document what was obviously a rare wildlife encounter. But his concern for Natalie's safety and the well-being of their guests overrode his professional curiosity and photographer's instincts. Natalie Peters, still wearing her wedding dress and accompanied by her bridesmaids, initially struggled to comprehend how a bear encounter could be occurring during what should have been the most carefully planned and controlled day of her life. Her nursing background had prepared her to respond effectively to medical emergencies and high-stress situations. But those skills were not directly applicable to wildlife encounters that required different knowledge and decision-making processes. The evacuation of ceremony guests to the main lodge building proceeded with reasonable efficiency, given the unexpected nature of the emergency and the formal attire that limited some participants' mobility across the uneven terrain between the ceremony site and the safety of the building's interior. Wedding coordinator Jennifer Walsh and property manager David Chen coordinated the movement of people while maintaining communication with the catering staff, who remained in visual contact with the bear while seeking opportunities to retrieve essential equipment and secure the area. As the human evacuation proceeded, Bear 411 continued his methodical investigation of the catering area, consuming available food items while showing no immediate signs of aggressive behavior toward the humans who had retreated to what they perceived as safe distances. His feeding behavior was characteristic of an animal that had achieved access to a concentrated food source and was focused primarily on maximizing his caloric intake rather than defending territory or responding to perceived threats. However, the bear's tolerance for human presence and his focus on feeding created a deceptive sense of predictability that masked the potential for rapid behavioral changes if circumstances shifted in ways that triggered defensive or aggressive responses. Wildlife behaviorists would later note that the bear's apparently calm demeanor during this initial phase of the encounter reflected his assessment of the humans as non-threatening rather than any inherent docility or habituation to human presence. At 3:57, as the evacuation of ceremony guests continued and the bear maintained his focus on the catering area, property manager David Chen initiated contact with emergency services in Jackson to request assistance from wildlife management authorities and emergency medical personnel. His call to Teton County Emergency Dispatch was logged at 15:57:34 and included a request for immediate response from Wyoming Game and Fish Department wildlife specialists, Teton County Sheriff's Office personnel, and Jackson Hole Emergency Medical Services, with the understanding that response times to the remote location would be significantly longer than for emergencies within the Jackson city limits. The emergency dispatch operator, Sarah Williams, a 15-year veteran of the county's emergency response system, immediately recognized the serious nature of the situation and began coordinating the multi-agency response that would be required to address both the immediate wildlife hazard and the potential for human casualties. Her protocols included notification of area hospitals to prepare for possible wildlife attack victims, coordination with helicopter services for potential medical evacuation from the remote location, and activation of specialized wildlife management personnel trained in dealing with large predator emergencies. The response time estimates provided by dispatch indicated that the earliest possible arrival of professional assistance would be approximately 25 to 30 minutes, depending on the availability of personnel and the condition of access roads roads to the lodge property. This timeline meant that the wedding party would need to manage the situation independently for an extended period, while maintaining safety protocols and avoiding actions that might escalate the bear's aggressive potential. Wildlife specialist Dr. Amanda Foster, who would later lead the investigation into the incident, was contacted at 16:01 while conducting routine fieldwork in Grand Teton National Park, approximately 18 miles from the lodge location. Her immediate assessment of the reported situation, based on her 12 years of experience managing human-bear conflicts in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, indicated a high probability for serious escalation, given the combination of factors including the bear's apparent boldness in approaching human activity, the large number of people potentially at risk, and the limited options for professional intervention in the remote location. As the emergency response was being coordinated, the situation at Rustic Ridge Lodge continued to evolve in ways that increased both the complexity and the danger facing the wedding party. Bear 411 had completed his initial investigation of the catering area and consumed readily accessible food items, but rather than departing the area as hoped by the human observers, he began expanding his search to include other potential food sources around the lodge property. The bear's movement toward the main lodge building at 4:02 represented a significant escalation in the developing crisis, as it brought him into direct proximity to the largest concentration of potential victims who had sought refuge inside what they believed to be a secure structure. The lodge's construction, while robust and well-suited to mountain weather conditions, had not been designed to exclude a determined grizzly bear whose powerful claws and teeth could potentially breach doors, windows, or other structural elements if sufficient motivation existed. Property manager David Chen, observing the bear's movement from a second-floor window of the lodge, made the critical decision to secure all exterior doors and windows while directing guests away from ground-floor areas that might be accessible to the animal should it decide to attempt entry. His experience with wildlife encounters had taught him that bears were capable of remarkable persistence and problem-solving ability when motivated by food or other strong drives, making it essential to eliminate any easy access points that might encourage the animal to view the building as a potential food source. The atmosphere inside the main lodge during this period was characterized by a mixture of anxiety, excitement, and uncertainty as guests struggled to process the unprecedented situation and determine appropriate responses. Conversations ranged from nervous jokes about unexpected wedding entertainment to serious discussions about bear behavior and safety protocols, while the bride and groom found themselves in the surreal position of managing a wildlife emergency while still wearing their formal wedding attire. Robert Peters, Natalie's father, and the primary organizer of the wedding celebration, experienced a complex mixture of emotions as he watched the situation unfold, including concern for the safety of the guests he had invited to this remote location, frustration with the circumstances that had disrupted his daughter's carefully planned wedding day, and a growing sense of responsibility for the potential consequences of decisions that had seemed perfectly reasonable during the planning process, but now appeared to have exposed everyone to unnecessary risk. The wedding photographer, Lisa Chang, faced an ethical and professional dilemma as she observed the developing situation through the lodge windows, torn between her instinct to document what was obviously a unique and newsworthy wildlife encounter and her responsibility to respect the privacy and dignity of her clients during what had become an emergency rather than a celebration. Her professional equipment remained readily accessible, but her decision-making process was complicated by uncertainty about whether documentation of the crisis would ultimately serve the interests of those involved or merely satisfy public curiosity about unusual wildlife encounters. At 4:05, Bear 411 reached the exterior of the main lodge building and began investigating the wraparound deck where the wedding party had enjoyed their morning brunch activities. The Bear's exploration of this area was methodical and thorough, including examination of outdoor furniture, decorative elements, and any residual food odors that might indicate additional resources worth pursuing. His massive size became particularly apparent as he moved among human-scale furnishings, his head easily reaching the height of deck railings, while his overall bulk dwarfed chairs and tables that appeared substantial when used by human occupants. The Bear's investigation of the deck area brought him into direct visual contact with many of the wedding guests who were observing from inside the lodge, creating a surreal tableau as formally dressed humans watched a massive wild predator conducting what appeared to be a systematic security inspection of their temporary refuge. The proximity of the encounter, with only glass windows separating the two species, provided an unprecedented opportunity for observation of grizzly bear behavior, while simultaneously creating a sense of vulnerability that heightened the emotional intensity of the situation. Wildlife photographer Michael Harrison, despite his professional experience and knowledge of bear behavior, found himself in the unprecedented position of being potential prey rather than observer, a role reversal that fundamentally altered his perception of the encounter and forced him to suppress his professional instincts in favor of protective behavior toward his new wife and the other wedding guests. His camera equipment remained accessible, but his priority was ensuring Natalie's safety and supporting the group's collective security, rather than documenting what would undoubtedly be remarkable footage of grizzly bear behavior in close proximity to humans. The bear's inspection of the lodge exterior revealed several potential entry points that could be exploited if his motivation to access the interior became sufficiently strong, including French doors leading to the main dining area, large windows at ground level, and a side entrance near the kitchen that had been left unlocked during the evacuation process. Property manager David Chen observed these vulnerabilities with growing concern, recognizing that the lodge's design prioritized aesthetic appeal and guest comfort rather than security against large predators. At 4:08, Bear 411 discovered the outdoor smoker where the bison tenderloin for the evening's dinner had been slow cooking since early morning, creating a concentrated source of meat odors that immediately captured his complete attention and triggered intensified feeding behavior. The smoker, designed to maintain controlled temperatures for extended periods while infusing meat with aromatic wood smoke, had been producing an olfactory beacon that was irresistible to a hungry bear, whose natural diet included substantial quantities of meat when available. The bear's investigation of the smoker involved both olfactory examination and physical manipulation, using his powerful claws to test the structural integrity of the device and assess the accessibility of the meat contained within. The smoker's construction, while adequate for normal outdoor cooking applications, was not designed to resist the problem-solving abilities and brute strength of a mature grizzly bear determined to access the food source it contained. The sounds of the bear's manipulation of the smoker, including metallic scraping and the occasional low grunt or breath, were clearly audible to the wedding guests inside the lodge and created a visceral awareness of the animal's proximity and power that intensified the psychological impact of the encounter. The reality of sharing space with a large predator, even with the supposed safety of building walls and windows, challenged the fundamental assumptions about human dominance and security that most of the guests had never previously questioned. Chef Isabella Rodriguez, watching from inside the lodge as months of preparation and thousands of dollars of premium ingredients were being consumed or destroyed by the bear, experienced a professional crisis that combined financial concerns with personal safety fears and a growing sense of helplessness in the face of circumstances completely beyond her control or experience. Her professional training had prepared her for kitchen fires, equipment failures, and demanding clients, but nothing in her background had addressed the protocols for wildlife encounters that threatened both human safety and business operations. At 4:12, the bear successfully breached the smoker's access door and began consuming the bison tenderloin that represented the centerpiece of the evening's planned dinner service. His feeding behavior was efficient and methodical, reflecting the opportunistic nature of large predators when presented with high-quality protein sources that required minimal energy expenditure to obtain and consume. The bear's obvious satisfaction with this food source created hope among the human observers that he might depart once his immediate hunger was satisfied. But wildlife behavior experts would later note that successful feeding often reinforces site fidelity and can encourage return visits rather than promoting departure. The consumption of the bison tenderloin required approximately 8 minutes, during which the bear remained focused on feeding while maintaining awareness of the human activity around him. His tolerance for the proximity of potential threats during this vulnerable feeding period reflected either confidence in his ability to defend the food source or assessment that the humans posed minimal immediate danger to his safety. Both interpretations that suggested a level of comfort with human presence that increased the potential for future conflicts. As 4:20 approached, representing 40 minutes past the original ceremony start time, the wedding party faced the unprecedented challenge of determining how to proceed with their celebration while managing an ongoing wildlife emergency that showed no signs of immediate resolution. The bride and groom, still dressed in their formal attire and surrounded by family and friends who had traveled great distances to participate in their wedding, found themselves negotiating between their desire to salvage some portion of their special day and their responsibility for the safety of everyone involved in the situation. The completion of the bear's consumption of the bison tenderloin at 4:21 was followed by a brief period of apparent satisfaction and reduced activity, during which Bear 411 remained in the immediate area of the smoker while showing decreased interest in active foraging behavior. This temporary lull in activity created a sense of cautious optimism among the human observers, who began to hope that the bear might now be satisfied enough to voluntarily depart the area and allow them to resume their celebration activities. However, wildlife behavior specialist Dr. Amanda Foster, who had been monitoring radio communications between the lodge and emergency services during her response to the scene, warned that bears often exhibit multiple feeding episodes during encounters with concentrated food sources, and that the apparent satisfaction following consumption of one food item did not guarantee that the animal would not continue searching for additional calories. Her professional assessment suggested that the bear's behavior indicated ongoing interest in the area rather than preparation for departure. The extended duration of the bear encounter had begun to create logistical challenges beyond the immediate safety concerns, including the need to maintain communication with emergency services, coordinate potential alternative arrangements for guests who might need to remain at the lodge overnight if evacuation was delayed, and address the practical consequences of cancelled wedding services and vendors who had been scheduled to provide evening entertainment and other activities. Wedding coordinator Jennifer Walsh faced the unprecedented challenge of managing client expectations and vendor relationships during a force majeure situation that was not addressed in any of her standard contracts or emergency protocols. Her experience with outdoor wedding challenges had included weather emergencies, equipment failures, and various human-related crises, but never a situation where wildlife posed direct physical threats to participants and could not be resolved through normal commercial or professional channels. At 4:25, Bear 411 concluded his investigation of the smoker area and began moving toward the reception site, where tables and chairs had been arranged for the evening's dinner service and where additional food-related odors suggested the possibility of other accessible resources. His movement was deliberate and unhurried, reflecting continued comfort with his surroundings and ongoing interest in exploring the area for additional feeding opportunities rather than any urgency related to departure or territorial concerns. The bear's approach to the reception area brought him within approximately 150 yards of the main lodge building where the wedding party remained gathered, close enough that his massive size and distinctive grizzly bear characteristics were clearly visible to observers, while his behavior could be monitored for signs of increasing aggression or changes in motivation that might affect the safety of the human occupants. The reception area investigation began with systematic examination of the dining tables that had been set with formal place settings, floral centerpieces, and various decorative elements intended to create an elegant outdoor dining environment. The bear's size allowed him to easily access table surfaces and examine items that would normally be beyond the reach of smaller wildlife, while his powerful claws and teeth enabled him to investigate containers and decorative elements that might conceal food sources or interesting odors. The destruction of formal table settings and decorative elements, while not directly threatening human safety, represented significant financial loss and emotional impact for the bride and groom, who watched months of planning and thousands of dollars of rentals and decorations being systematically dismantled by an animal whose behavior could not be influenced by human concerns about property damage or sentimental value. The bear's investigation of the reception area revealed several items that contained food-related odors or materials, including wrapped party favors that contained locally made chocolates, floral arrangements that included berry-bearing branches, and various decorative elements that had been in contact with food preparation areas, and retained residual scents that were detectable by the bear's extraordinarily sensitive olfactory system. At 4:32, as Bear 411 continued his systematic investigation of the reception area, the first emergency response personnel reached the vicinity of Rustic Ridge Lodge. Wyoming Game and Fish Wildlife Specialist Tom Mitchell, responding from his duty station near Moran Junction, had made the 26-mile drive in approximately 31 minutes, while maintaining radio contact with both the lodge occupants and emergency dispatch coordinators who were tracking the developing situation. Mitchell's initial assessment of the situation, conducted from a safe distance using binoculars and radio communication with property manager David Chen, confirmed that the animal was indeed a mature male grizzly bear, exhibiting bold feeding behavior in close proximity to human activity. His professional evaluation indicated that the bear's behavior pattern suggested strong food motivation rather than territorial aggression, but noted that the animal's size, proximity to human activity, and apparent comfort level created significant potential for escalation if circumstances changed or if intervention strategies were not carefully planned and executed. The wildlife specialist's immediate priorities included establishing secure observation posts that would allow detailed monitoring of the bear's behavior, while ensuring the safety of response personnel, coordinating with additional emergency services that were en route to the scene, and developing intervention strategies that would encourage the bear to leave the area without creating additional risks to human safety or triggering aggressive behavior that could worsen the situation. The arrival of professional wildlife management expertise provided some reassurance to the wedding party, but also confirmed the serious nature of their situation and the potential for extended duration of the emergency as officials developed and implemented appropriate response strategies. The complexity of managing large predator encounters in areas with significant human presence required careful planning and coordination that could not be rushed without creating additional risks for everyone involved. Mitchell's radio communication with Dr. Amanda Foster, who remained approximately 10 minutes away from the scene, included detailed descriptions of the bear's size, behavior patterns, and current location relative to human activity. Information that would be crucial for developing intervention strategies and assessing potential risk factors that might influence the animal's future behavior. His professional assessment suggested that the bear's boldness and apparent comfort level around human activity represented significant concern for both immediate and long-term management implications. At 4:36, Bear 411 completed his investigation of the reception area and began moving toward the lodge's main entrance, where the concentrated odors of food preparation and human activity suggested additional opportunities for resource acquisition. His approach to the building represented the most direct threat yet posed to the wedding party, who had been relying on the assumption that the lodge's structure would provide adequate separation and protection from the wildlife encounter occurring outside. The bear's investigation of the lodge entrance included detailed olfactory examination of doors, windows, and other structural elements that might provide access to interior spaces where human activity had generated detectable food odors. His powerful sense of smell enabled him to identify specific locations where food preparation, consumption, or storage had occurred, creating a detailed map of potential resources that might be accessible through determined physical effort. Property manager David Chen, observing the bear's behavior from interior vantage points, implemented additional security measures, including the positioning of furniture to block potential entry points and the preparation of noise-making devices that might be used to deter aggressive behavior if the bear attempted to gain access to the building's interior. His actions were guided by standard bear country protocols, but the unusual circumstances of managing a wildlife emergency during a large social gathering required adaptation of normal procedures to address the specific challenges of the situation. The bear's investigation of the lodge exterior continued for approximately 6 minutes, during which his massive size and obvious physical power were displayed in full detail to the wedding guests who observed from behind glass windows and doors. The psychological impact of this close encounter with a large predator created lasting impressions that would influence the participants' future attitudes toward wilderness activities and outdoor celebrations in wildlife habitat. At 4:42, Bear 411 detected concentrated food odors emanating from the lodge's kitchen area, where the catering staff had been preparing various components of the evening's menu before the emergency evacuation occurred. The intensity of these odors, combined with the bear's successful feeding experiences earlier in the encounter, motivated him to investigate potential access routes to the interior spaces where the most appealing resources appeared to be located. The bear's examination of potential entry points included testing the structural integrity of doors, windows, and other architectural elements using his powerful claws and teeth, creating visible damage to the lodge's exterior while generating sounds that were clearly audible to the occupants inside. The reality of a 700-pound predator actively investigating methods of gaining access to their refuge created intense psychological pressure for the wedding guests, who had to confront the possibility that their assumed safety might be less secure than they had believed. Wildlife specialist Tom Mitchell, observing the bear's behavior from his position approximately 200 yards from the lodge, recognized the escalating nature of the situation and the potential for the animal to breach the building's security if his motivation to access interior food sources became sufficiently intense. His radio communication with emergency dispatch included a request for additional personnel and equipment that might be required if intervention strategies became necessary to protect human safety. The bear's investigation of the lodge exterior revealed several vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited by an animal of his size and determination, including French doors with decorative glass panels, ground-level windows with relatively lightweight frames, and a side entrance that had sustained minor damage during the initial evacuation and might be susceptible to forced entry by a powerful predator motivated by accessible food sources. At 4:47, Bear 411 focused his attention on the French doors leading to the lodge's main dining area, where the concentration of food odors was strongest and where the structural elements appeared most likely to yield to persistent physical pressure. His initial testing of the door's integrity involved careful manipulation using his claws, while avoiding actions that might trigger sudden failure and expose him to unexpected dangers associated with broken glass or structural collapse. The bear's methodical approach to problem-solving, demonstrated by his careful testing of the door structure before applying significant force, reflected the intelligence and adaptability that made grizzly bears such successful survivors in challenging environments. However, these same characteristics that ensured the species' evolutionary success also created significant challenges for wildlife managers attempting to deter unwanted behavior or encourage departure from human-occupied areas. The wedding guests inside the lodge, watching the bears' investigation of their primary refuge, experienced intense anxiety as they realized that their safety was dependent on architectural elements that had been designed for aesthetic appeal and weather protection rather than security against large predators. The psychological impact of observing a powerful wild animal systematically testing their defenses created lasting trauma that would affect many participants long after the immediate physical danger had passed. Property manager David Chen made the decision to activate noise-making devices in an attempt to discourage the bear's investigation of the building entrance, using air horns and metal pot banging to create sudden, loud sounds that might startle the animal and encourage retreat. However, Bear 411's reaction to these deterrent attempts was minimal, suggesting either habituation to human-generated noise or determination that outweighed his natural caution around unfamiliar sounds. At 4:51, the bear applied increasing pressure to the French doors, causing visible flexing in the door frame and audible stress sounds from the structural elements that supported the glass panels. The wedding party inside the dining area retreated to interior locations further from the potential breach point, while maintaining observation of the bear's activities through windows that offered alternative vantage points of the developing crisis. Dr. Amanda Foster arrived on scene at 4:53, bringing specialized wildlife management equipment and extensive experience in human-bear conflict resolution to supplement the resources already available for addressing the emergency. Her initial assessment of the situation confirmed the serious nature of the threat posed by the bear's persistent investigation of building entry points, while his size and apparent comfort level around human activity suggested that standard deterrent methods might prove inadequate for encouraging voluntary departure. The wildlife specialist's immediate priorities included coordination with law enforcement personnel who were also responding to the emergency, establishment of secure positions that would allow safe implementation of intervention strategies, and preparation of equipment that might be required for either hazing the bear away from human activity or, as a last resort, lethal intervention to protect human safety if other methods proved unsuccessful. The arrival of professional wildlife management expertise provided the wedding party with reassurance that qualified personnel were now available to address their situation, but also confirmed the potential seriousness of their circumstances and the possibility that resolution might require intervention methods that could result in harm to the bear, an outcome that many of the wildlife-loving participants found emotionally difficult to accept despite their concern for human safety. At 4:56, Bear 411 successfully breached the French doors leading to the lodge's dining area, gaining access to the interior spaces where the wedding party had sought refuge, and creating the most dangerous phase of the encounter as human and predator found themselves sharing confined spaces with limited escape routes for either species. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood announced the escalation of the crisis to a level that required immediate action to prevent potential casualties among the trapped wedding guests. The bear's entry into the lodge interior was methodical rather than aggressive, reflecting his primary motivation of accessing food sources rather than pursuing conflict with the human occupants. However, his massive size and presence in the confined spaces of the building created intense fear among the wedding guests, who found themselves face to face with a large predator in circumstances that offered limited options for retreat or self-defense. Natalie Peters, still wearing her wedding dress, found herself pressed against the back wall of the dining area, along with her bridesmaids and immediate family members, as the bear began investigating the interior spaces with the same systematic approach he had demonstrated throughout the outdoor portions of the encounter. Her nursing training had prepared her for medical emergencies and high-stress situations, but the present circumstances required different skills and knowledge that she had never needed to develop or apply. Michael Harrison positioned himself between the bear and his new wife, drawing upon his years of wildlife photography experience to assess the animal's behavior and determine appropriate responses that might minimize the risk of triggering aggressive behavior. His professional knowledge suggested that the bear's focus on food sources rather than human activity offered the best hope for peaceful resolution. But the confined spaces and limited escape routes created circumstances that significantly increased the potential for dangerous confrontation. The bear's investigation of the lodge interior began with the kitchen area, where the concentration of food odors was strongest, and where various ingredients and prepared items remained accessible despite the earlier evacuation efforts. His systematic examination of cabinets, refrigeration units, and food storage areas demonstrated the problem-solving abilities that allowed grizzly bears to exploit diverse food sources across their wide-ranging habitats. Robert Peters, standing near his daughter and new son-in-law, experienced a profound sense of responsibility for the dangerous situation that his wedding planning decisions had created, combined with helplessness in the face of circumstances that were completely beyond his engineering background and problem-solving experience. His paternal instincts to protect Natalie were constrained by the reality that any sudden movement or aggressive action could trigger defensive behavior from the bear that might endanger everyone in the confined space. At 5:02, Bear 411 discovered the main food storage area where catering supplies had been organized for the evening's dinner service, including backup ingredients and prepared items that had been kept in refrigeration during the day's activities. His investigation of these resources provided him with access to high-quality food sources that satisfied his immediate needs, while keeping him occupied in activities that did not directly threaten the human occupants who remained pressed against the far wall of the dining area. The bear's feeding behavior in the lodge kitchen created a surreal scene as wedding guests in formal attire watched a massive wild predator systematically consuming the food that had been intended for their celebration dinner. The juxtaposition of elegant party preparations and raw wilderness encounter created lasting memories that would fundamentally alter the participants' understanding of their relationship with the natural world and their assumptions about human dominance over wildlife. Wildlife specialist Dr. Amanda Foster, coordinating with Tom Mitchell and newly arrived law enforcement personnel, developed intervention strategies that prioritized human safety while minimizing harm to the bear if peaceful resolution remained possible. Her assessment of the situation indicated that the animal's focus on food sources rather than territorial or defensive behavior offered hope for encouraging voluntary departure once his immediate needs were satisfied. The intervention plan included preparation of hazing equipment that could be used to encourage the bear to leave the building if his feeding activities concluded without triggering aggressive behavior, as well as lethal force options that would be available if the situation deteriorated to the point where human casualties appeared imminent. The decision-making protocols for implementing these various options required careful assessment of rapidly changing circumstances and coordination among multiple agencies with different priorities and areas of expertise. At 5:07, Bear 411 concluded his investigation of the kitchen area and began exploring other interior spaces of the lodge, including the main living area where wedding guests had gathered during the earlier stages of the encounter. His movement through the building demonstrated remarkable agility for an animal of his size, while his continued focus on olfactory investigation suggested ongoing search for additional food sources rather than territorial or aggressive intentions toward the human occupants. The bear's exploration of the lodge interior brought him into increasingly close proximity to the wedding party, who had limited options for retreat given the building's layout and the animal's presence near the primary exit routes. The psychological impact of sharing confined space with a large predator created intense stress among participants, while the formal attire and celebration context made the situation particularly surreal and difficult to process emotionally. Amanda Thompson, serving as maid of honor and positioned near Natalie during the crisis, drew upon her pediatric nursing experience to help maintain calm among the group while monitoring individuals for signs of panic or medical distress that might require intervention. Her professional training in crisis management proved valuable for supporting group cohesion during the extended emergency, though nothing in her background had prepared her for wilderness survival situations involving large predators. The wedding photographer, Lisa Chang, faced ongoing ethical dilemmas about documenting the encounter, particularly as the situation had evolved from an outdoor wildlife sighting to a direct threat to human safety. Her professional instincts to record unique events conflicted with respect for her client's privacy and dignity during a traumatic experience, while practical concerns about personal safety made photography equipment secondary to survival priorities. At 5:12, Bear 411 detected the concentrated human scents and elevated stress pheromones emanating from the wedding party gathered at the far end of the dining area, causing him to raise his massive head and focus his attention directly on the group of formally dressed individuals who had been maintaining their position against the back wall throughout his interior investigation. For the first time since entering the building, the bear's behavior shifted from food-oriented exploration to direct awareness of the human presence, creating the most dangerous moment of the encounter as predator and potential prey established direct visual and olfactory contact in confined spaces. The bear's head, easily the size of a large television and supported by a neck thick with muscle and fat, turned slowly toward the wedding party as his small dark eyes assessed the situation with the calculating intelligence that had enabled his species to survive and thrive across diverse and challenging environments. His ears, relatively small compared to his massive skull, but extraordinarily sensitive to sound, swiveled forward to capture any audio information that might help him evaluate the threat level and behavioral intentions of the humans who shared his immediate space. The wedding guests, frozen in terror as the bear's direct attention focused upon them, experienced the primal fear response that had been encoded in human genetics through millions of years of evolution alongside large predators. Heart rates accelerated, Breathing became shallow and rapid, and adrenaline flooded bloodstreams as fight-or-flight responses activated despite the obvious futility of either option, given the confined space and the overwhelming physical advantages possessed by their potential adversary. Natalie Peters, still wearing her ivory wedding dress now wrinkled and stained from the day's unexpected events, felt Michael's hand grip hers with crushing intensity as they both recognized that their wedding day had evolved into a life-or-death survival situation that neither their combined outdoor experience nor their individual professional backgrounds had prepared them to navigate successfully. The irony of facing potential death while dressed for the happiest day of their lives created a psychological disconnect that their minds struggled to process coherently. Bear 411's assessment of the human group lasted approximately 45 seconds, during which his massive body remained motionless while his sensory systems gathered information about the potential threat or opportunity represented by the formally dressed individuals pressed against the far wall of the dining area. His extraordinary sense of smell provided detailed information about each individual's emotional state, health status, and recent activities, while his eyesight, though not as acute as his olfactory capabilities, enabled him to assess body language and positioning that might indicate aggressive or submissive intentions. The bear's behavioral analysis concluded that the humans represented neither immediate threat nor particular opportunity, leading him to resume his exploration of the lodge interior with continued focus on locating additional food sources rather than investigating or interacting with the wedding party. His dismissal of the human presence as irrelevant to his current priorities provided temporary relief to the terrified guests, though they remained acutely aware that circumstances could change rapidly if the bear's assessment or motivations shifted in response to unexpected stimuli or changing conditions. Dr. Amanda Foster, monitoring the situation from outside the lodge through radio communication with property manager David Chen, who had maintained cell phone contact despite the building's compromised security, received regular updates on the bear's location and behavior that enabled her to track the progression of the interior encounter while developing intervention strategies that might encourage the animal to exit voluntarily without triggering defensive or aggressive responses that could endanger the trapped wedding guests. The wildlife specialist's assessment of the situation indicated that the bear's continued focus on food sources rather than human interaction offered the best hope for peaceful resolution, but the confined spaces and limited escape routes created circumstances where even minor behavioral changes could escalate rapidly into life-threatening confrontations. Her intervention planning required balancing the need for decisive action to protect human safety against the risks associated with startling or threatening an already nervous animal in circumstances where retreat options were limited for both species. At 5:17, Bear 411 discovered a secondary food storage area in the lodge's pantry, where additional catering supplies and emergency provisions maintained by the property management had been stored in containers that proved inadequate barriers against his powerful claws and teeth. His systematic dismantling of storage containers and consumption of accessible food items kept him occupied in activities that maintained distance from the wedding party while satisfying his immediate nutritional needs. The sounds of the bear's feeding activities, including the tearing of packaging, crushing of containers, and occasional grunts of satisfaction, provided the wedding guests with auditory information about his location and activities that enabled them to monitor his movements without direct visual contact. The bizarre soundtrack of destruction and consumption created a surreal atmosphere that emphasized the fundamental disruption of normal human expectations and the intrusion of wild nature into carefully planned civilization. Chef Isabella Rodriguez, watching from her position with the other wedding guests, calculated the monetary value of the food being consumed and destroyed by the bear, estimating thousands of dollars in direct losses, plus the incalculable costs associated with cancelled services, damaged equipment, and potential legal liabilities arising from the unprecedented circumstances. Her professional reputation and financial security were suffering significant damage from an event that no amount of planning or expertise could have anticipated or prevented. The catering staff's investment in the wedding included not only food costs, but also labor, transportation, equipment rental, and opportunity costs associated with turning away other potential clients to accommodate the lodge event. The Bears' systematic destruction of their work represented financial catastrophe for a small business operating on typically narrow profit margins, while insurance coverage for wildlife-related losses remained uncertain pending investigation of policy language and coverage exclusions. Wedding coordinator Jennifer Walsh, maintaining communication between the lodge interior and the emergency response teams gathering outside, faced the unprecedented challenge of managing client relations during an active predator encounter while coordinating with law enforcement and wildlife management personnel whose priorities necessarily focused on immediate safety rather than preservation of wedding services or vendor interests. Her professional obligations conflicted with survival instincts as she attempted to fulfill contractual responsibilities under circumstances that rendered normal performance standards meaningless. At 5:23, the Bear concluded his investigation of the pantry area and began moving toward the lodge's second floor, where guest bedrooms contained personal belongings and food items that wedding party members had brought for their extended stay at the property. His movement up the wooden staircase, each step accompanied by creaking sounds that emphasized his massive weight, brought him into areas of the building where human scent concentrations were strongest and where personal possessions might contain food-related odors that attracted his attention. The wedding guest's realization that the Bear was expanding his investigation to include the upper level of the lodge created new anxieties about personal belongings, medications, and sentimental items that might be damaged or destroyed during his systematic search for food sources. Luggage and personal effects that contained toiletries, snacks, or other items with appealing scents became potential targets for investigation by an animal whose curiosity and problem-solving abilities enabled him to access containers and storage areas that would normally be secure from wildlife encounters. Michael Harrison's photography equipment, stored in a second-floor guest room, included expensive cameras and lenses that represented both his professional livelihood and his personal passion for documenting wildlife behavior. The irony of potentially losing equipment to the very type of animal he had spent years photographing was not lost on him, though his immediate concerns focused on human safety rather than material possessions that could ultimately be replaced through insurance claims. Natalie's wedding dress and accessories, chosen after months of careful shopping and fitting appointments, had already sustained damage from the day's unexpected activities, but the sentimental value of these items far exceeded their monetary cost. The transformation of what should have been treasured keepsakes of the happiest day of her life into casualties of a wildlife encounter represented emotional trauma that would require significant time and support to process and integrate into her understanding of the experience. At 5:27, Bear 411 began investigating the master bedroom where Natalie and Michael had prepared for their wedding ceremony, discovering personal care items, snacks, and other materials that contained interesting scents worthy of detailed examination. His systematic dismantling of luggage and personal belongings demonstrated the thoroughness that characterized his approach to resource assessment, while his powerful claws and teeth enabled him to access items stored in containers that were designed for travel security rather than wildlife protection. The sounds of the Bear's investigation of the upper level, clearly audible to the wedding guests gathered below, created vivid mental images of destruction and violation of personal space that intensified the psychological impact of the encounter. The knowledge that their most intimate possessions were being examined and potentially destroyed by a wild animal represented a form of violation that went beyond simple property damage to touch on fundamental concepts of privacy, security, and human control over their environment. Dr. Amanda Foster's assessment of the situation had evolved to include growing concern about the duration of the bear's presence inside the lodge and the potential for habituation to human spaces and scents that could create long-term management challenges even after the immediate crisis was resolved. Bears that learn to associate human buildings with food sources often return to investigate similar opportunities, creating ongoing risks for property owners and future visitors to areas where successful feeding experiences had occurred. The wildlife specialists' intervention planning had progressed to include preparation for forced removal of the bear from the lodge interior, using hazing techniques designed to create negative associations with human structures while encouraging retreat to wild areas where natural food sources remained available. However, the implementation of these strategies required careful timing and coordination to avoid triggering defensive behavior that could endanger the wedding guests who remained trapped in close proximity to the animal. Law enforcement personnel, led by Teton County Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Rodriguez, had established a perimeter around the lodge property and coordinated with wildlife management specialists to develop tactical approaches that prioritized human safety while preserving options for non-lethal resolution of the crisis. Deputy Rodriguez's 15 years of experience in rural law enforcement had included several bear encounters, but never a situation involving a large predator inside an occupied building with multiple potential victims. The tactical assessment conducted by law enforcement and wildlife management personnel identified several challenges unique to the current situation, including the need to coordinate intervention strategies that addressed both the bear's location inside the building and the presence of civilians who could not be evacuated, while the animal remained between them and the primary exit routes. The confined spaces and structural limitations of the lodge building restricted options for both human movement and wildlife management activities. At 5:32, Bear 411 completed his investigation of the master bedroom and began exploring additional guest rooms on the upper level, where other wedding party members had stored personal belongings and where bathroom facilities might contain toiletries or medications with appealing scents. His methodical approach to searching each room demonstrated remarkable persistence and problem-solving ability, while his continued focus on olfactory investigation suggested that his feeding motivation remained the primary driver of his behavior rather than territorial or aggressive instincts. The bear's investigation of guest bathrooms revealed various personal care products that contained scents or ingredients worthy of examination, including toothpaste, soap, shampoo, and medications that had been flavored or scented to improve palatability for human use. His systematic testing of these items, while not providing significant nutritional value, satisfied his curiosity about unfamiliar substances while keeping him occupied in activities that maintained distance from the wedding guests below. Emergency medical services personnel, led by Jackson Hole Fire Department paramedic Susan Chen, had arrived on scene and established treatment protocols for potential wildlife attack victims, including trauma care capabilities and helicopter evacuation procedures that could be implemented if serious injuries occurred during the ongoing encounter. Paramedic Chen's background included wilderness medicine training and experience with wildlife-related injuries, though the current situation's complexity exceeded the scope of typical emergency medical response scenarios. The medical team's preparation included blood products for transfusion, surgical equipment for emergency field treatment of traumatic injuries, and communication protocols with regional trauma centers that could provide advanced care if patient transport became necessary. Their positioning near the lodge provided immediate response capabilities while maintaining safe distances from the active wildlife encounter that continued to evolve inside the building. At 5:37, the bear concluded his investigation of the upper-level guest rooms and began moving back toward the staircase, apparently satisfied with his systematic exploration of the lodge interior and the feeding opportunities he had discovered throughout the building. His movement back toward the ground level created both relief and renewed anxiety among the wedding guests, who welcomed his departure from the upper level while recognizing that his return to their immediate area renewed the potential for direct confrontation. The bear's descent of the wooden staircase, accompanied by the same creaking sounds that had marked his ascent, provided auditory confirmation of his location and movement direction for the wedding guests, who remained pressed against the dining area wall. Their ability to track his position through sound enabled them to maintain situational awareness without requiring direct visual contact that might be interpreted as threatening or aggressive behavior by the animal. Bear 411's return to the ground level coincided with his apparent completion of systematic investigation of the lodge interior, having examined all areas that contained interesting scents or potential food sources. His behavior suggested satisfaction with the feeding opportunities he had discovered, rather than ongoing search for additional resources, creating hope among human observers that he might now be motivated to exit the building and return to wild areas where his presence would pose less immediate threat to human safety. Dr. Amanda Foster, receiving regular updates on the bear's location and behavior through radio communication with the lodge occupants, recognized this transition period as potentially offering the best opportunity for implementing intervention strategies designed to encourage voluntary departure. Her assessment indicated that the animal's apparent satisfaction with his feeding activities might make him more receptive to hazing techniques that created incentives for leaving the human-occupied area. The wildlife specialist's intervention plan included the use of acoustic deterrents positioned outside the lodge that could be activated if the bear approached exit points, creating negative stimuli associated with human structures while providing clear pathways for retreat to natural habitat areas. The timing and coordination of these deterrent activities required careful planning to avoid triggering defensive behavior while maximizing the likelihood of successful resolution. At 5:41, Bear 411 approached the damaged French doors through which he had originally entered the lodge building, pausing to investigate the exit route while assessing external conditions that might influence his decision to leave the interior spaces. His behavior suggested evaluation of factors including potential threats, weather conditions, and the availability of additional feeding opportunities outside the building, indicating decision-making processes that balanced various priorities and environmental factors. The bear's investigation of the exit area created intense anticipation among the wedding guests, who recognized that his departure would restore their safety and freedom of movement while ending the most dangerous phase of their wildlife encounter. However, their relief was tempered by awareness that the animal's presence in the immediate area would continue to pose risks until he moved away from the lodge property and returned to his natural territory. Wildlife management personnel positioned around the lodge property prepared to implement hazing protocols as soon as the bear exited the building, using techniques designed to reinforce his departure while discouraging return visits that could create ongoing safety concerns for current and future lodge occupants. The coordination of these activities required precise timing and communication to ensure effectiveness while minimizing risks to both human safety and bear welfare. The intervention strategies developed by Dr. Foster included both immediate hazing techniques to encourage departure and longer-term monitoring protocols to track the bear's movements and assess the success of deterrent activities. The goal was not only to resolve the current crisis, but also to prevent future encounters that could result in more serious consequences for both human safety and wildlife management objectives. At 5:44, Bear 411 stepped through the damaged French doors and exited the lodge interior, returning to the outdoor areas where his encounter with the wedding party had begun more than an hour earlier. His emergence from the building provided immediate relief to the trapped guests, while creating new challenges for wildlife management personnel, who now needed to guide his departure from the property using techniques that balanced effectiveness with safety for all participants. The bear's exit from the lodge interior marked the end of the most dangerous phase of the encounter, though his continued presence on the property meant that safety protocols remained in effect, while emergency personnel worked to encourage his return to natural habitat areas. The wedding guests, while no longer trapped in confined spaces with a large predator, remained inside the building until professional wildlife managers could confirm that the animal had moved to safe distances from human activity. Dr. Amanda Foster coordinated the implementation of hazing protocols designed to encourage the bear's departure, using acoustic deterrents and human presence to create negative associations with the lodge area while providing clear pathways for retreat to the forest areas that represented his natural territory. The success of these techniques depended on careful timing and coordination to avoid accidentally trapping the animal or triggering defensive behavior that could escalate the situation. The hazing activities included the use of air horns, shouting, and coordinated human movement designed to make the lodge area uncomfortable for the bear while avoiding direct confrontation that could provoke aggressive responses. The goal was to convince the animal that the benefits of remaining in the area were outweighed by the stress and discomfort associated with human presence, encouraging voluntary departure without creating additional risks for either species. At 5:49, Bear 411 responded to the hazing activities by moving away from the immediate lodge area toward the forest edge, where natural cover and familiar territory offered security and retreat from the human activity that had become increasingly stressful and unrewarding. His departure represented successful resolution of the immediate crisis, though wildlife management protocols required continued monitoring to ensure that he moved to safe distances and did not attempt to return to the property. The bear's retreat into the forest provided the first opportunity for wedding guests to safely exit the lodge building since the encounter had begun, though emergency personnel maintained security protocols and escort procedures to ensure that human movement did not inadvertently interfere with the animal's departure or create new opportunities for dangerous interaction between species. The relief experienced by the wedding party as they emerged from the lodge into fresh air and open spaces was profound and emotionally overwhelming, with many participants experiencing delayed stress reactions as adrenaline levels subsided and the reality of their survival began to register fully. The transition from mortal danger to relative safety created complex emotional responses that would require significant time and support to process completely. Natalie Peters, still wearing her damaged wedding dress, found herself embracing Michael with an intensity that reflected both relief at their survival and grief for the loss of their carefully planned celebration. The realization that they had lived through a potentially fatal wildlife encounter while dressed for their wedding created a surreal emotional experience that would forever alter their understanding of the day that was supposed to mark the beginning of their married life together. Medical personnel immediately began assessment of all wedding party members for injuries, stress reactions, and other health concerns that might require treatment following their extended exposure to extreme psychological stress during the bear encounter. Paramedic Susan Chen's evaluation revealed no immediate physical injuries, but identified several individuals who exhibited symptoms of acute stress reactions that warranted monitoring and potential treatment. The medical assessment included evaluation for delayed shock reactions, anxiety symptoms, and other stress-related health concerns that commonly develop following traumatic encounters with large predators. The wedding guests' formal attire, while inappropriate for wilderness emergencies, had provided some protection from minor injuries that might have occurred during the evacuation and sheltering activities, though several participants had sustained cuts and bruises from moving through the lodge during the crisis. At 6:05, wildlife management personnel confirmed that Bear 411 had moved approximately 400 yards from the lodge property and appeared to be continuing his retreat toward the dense forest areas that represented his preferred habitat. Dr. Foster's assessment indicated successful resolution of the immediate crisis, though monitoring protocols would continue throughout the evening to ensure that the animal did not attempt to return to the lodge area. The success of the hazing activities in encouraging the bear's departure provided validation for non-lethal wildlife management techniques, while demonstrating the importance of professional expertise in resolving human-predator conflicts. The outcome preserved both human safety and bear welfare while providing valuable data about grizzly bear behavior in unusual circumstances that would inform future management strategies. Emergency response personnel began the process of securing the lodge property and assessing the damage caused by the bear's investigation of buildings, equipment, and personal belongings. The scope of destruction was extensive, but largely limited to property damage rather than human casualties, an outcome that wildlife management professionals considered remarkably fortunate given the duration and intensity of the encounter. The property assessment revealed structural damage to doors, windows, and interior fixtures that would require extensive repairs before the lodge could safely accommodate future guests. The catering equipment and food supplies had been largely destroyed or contaminated during the bear's feeding activities, while personal belongings of wedding guests had sustained varying degrees of damage depending on their location and the appeal of their scents to olfactory investigation. Insurance adjusters would later estimate the total property damage at approximately $47,000, not including the costs associated with cancelled wedding services, vendor compensation, and potential liability claims arising from the unprecedented circumstances. The financial impact extended beyond immediate property losses to include long-term effects on the lodge's reputation and ability to attract future bookings for events in wildlife habitat areas. At 6:15, with the immediate danger resolved and emergency personnel maintaining security protocols, the wedding party faced the unprecedented challenge of determining how to proceed with their celebration plans. The ceremony that should have taken place at 4 o'clock had been indefinitely postponed. The reception dinner had been consumed by a grizzly bear, and the romantic wilderness setting had been transformed into a crime scene requiring investigation by multiple government agencies. Natalie and Michael, consulting with their families and wedding coordinator Jennifer Walsh, made the difficult decision to postpone the formal ceremony until alternative arrangements could be made in a safer location. The emotional impact of their wedding day trauma required time and support to process before they could focus on celebration activities, while practical concerns about guest safety and vendor availability made immediate rescheduling impossible. The bride and groom's decision to prioritize emotional processing and safety over celebration represented mature recognition that their relationship had already been tested and strengthened by surviving a life-threatening crisis together. Their wedding story would forever include the account of facing a grizzly bear attack while dressed in formal attire, creating a unique and unforgettable foundation for their marriage that no traditional ceremony could have provided. Family members and friends rallied around the couple to provide emotional support and practical assistance in dealing with the aftermath of their traumatic experience. The shared survival of a dangerous wildlife encounter created bonds among the wedding party participants that transcended normal social relationships, while the bizarre circumstances of their formal attire during a wilderness emergency provided both tragic and comic elements that would require time to integrate into coherent memories. The investigation of the incident began immediately, with wildlife management personnel, law enforcement officials, and property management representatives collecting evidence and documenting the circumstances that had led to the unprecedented encounter. Dr. Amanda Foster's preliminary assessment identified several contributing factors, including drought conditions that had reduced natural food availability, the concentration of food odors from catering activities, and the bear's apparent comfort level around human activity. The investigation would ultimately reveal that Bear 411 had no previous history of aggressive behavior toward humans or property damage, suggesting that the incident resulted from environmental stresses and opportunistic feeding behavior rather than habituation or learned aggression. The bear's methodical approach and focus on food sources rather than human interaction indicated normal predator behavior under abnormal circumstances, rather than pathological aggression that would require lethal management action. Wildlife management authorities implemented monitoring protocols to track Bear 411's movements and behavior following the incident, using both remote sensing technology and field observations to assess whether the successful feeding experience at the lodge had created problematic associations that might lead to future conflicts. The goal was to ensure that the animal returned to normal wild behavior patterns while maintaining surveillance capabilities that could detect any concerning changes in his relationship with human activity. The monitoring data collected during the weeks following the incident indicated that Bear 411 had resumed normal foraging patterns in remote areas of his territory, showing no signs of seeking additional opportunities for human-related feeding or investigating human structures. His behavior suggested that the lodge encounter had been an opportunistic response to exceptional circumstances rather than a behavioral change that would create ongoing management concerns. At 6:30, as emergency personnel continued their investigation and security activities, the wedding guests began the process of collecting personal belongings and preparing for departure from the lodge property. The evacuation procedures required coordination with law enforcement and wildlife management personnel to ensure that human movement did not create new risks while the area remained under active monitoring for potential bear activity. The collection of personal belongings revealed the extent of damage caused by the bear's investigation of guest rooms and storage areas, with some items completely destroyed, while others remained intact, depending on their location and appeal to olfactory examination. Wedding guests found that toiletries, medications, and food items had been systematically examined and often consumed or destroyed, while clothing and electronic equipment had generally escaped significant damage. The emotional impact of seeing personal possessions that had been investigated by a wild predator created lasting psychological impressions that went beyond simple property damage to touch on fundamental concepts of privacy, security, and the boundaries between human civilization and wild nature. Many participants reported feeling violated by the bear's examination of their intimate belongings, even while intellectually understanding that the animal's behavior was driven by natural instincts rather than malicious intent. The transportation arrangements for evacuating wedding guests from the remote lodge location required coordination with local emergency services and private transportation providers, as many participants' vehicles remained accessible while others needed alternative arrangements due to the security protocols that remained in effect around the property. The logistics of moving more than 60 people from a remote location while maintaining safety procedures created additional challenges for emergency management personnel. Wedding coordinator Jennifer Walsh worked with property manager David Chen and emergency response officials to arrange hotel accommodations in Jackson for wedding guests who needed overnight lodging while making alternative travel arrangements. The unprecedented circumstances required flexibility and creativity in providing for the immediate needs of traumatized individuals while coordinating with various service providers who had never previously dealt with wildlife emergency evacuations. At 7 o'clock, as the autumn sun began setting behind the Teton Peaks and temperatures started dropping toward freezing, the evacuation of wedding guests from Rustic Ridge Lodge was substantially complete. The property would remain under wildlife management monitoring throughout the night, while emergency personnel completed their investigation and assessment of the damage caused by the unprecedented grizzly bear encounter. The last vehicles carrying wedding guests departed the lodge property at 7:23, marking the end of what should have been a joyful celebration, but had instead become a survival story that would be retold for generations within the families and social networks of all participants. The transformation of a wedding day into a wildlife emergency created memories that none of the participants would ever forget, though the psychological processing of these traumatic experiences would require significant time and professional support. Natalie and Michael, traveling together toward Jackson in a vehicle driven by Robert Peters, began the process of coming to terms with the reality that their wedding day would forever be associated with terror, survival, and the awesome power of wild nature, rather than the romantic celebration they had envisioned during 18 months of careful planning. The emotional complexity of their situation defied easy categorization, as they struggled to integrate feelings of gratitude for survival with grief for the loss of their special day. The couple's decision to postpone their formal ceremony until alternative arrangements could be made reflected wisdom and maturity in recognizing that celebration required emotional space that was not available in the immediate aftermath of trauma. Their relationship had been tested and strengthened by surviving a life-threatening crisis together, creating a foundation for their marriage that was far more substantial than any traditional wedding ceremony could have provided. The drive toward Jackson provided opportunity for initial processing of the day's events, though the full emotional impact of their experience would require weeks or months to integrate completely. The bizarre juxtaposition of formal wedding attire and wilderness survival created cognitive dissonance that challenged normal frameworks for understanding and categorizing life experiences, requiring new mental models for processing unprecedented situations. At 8:15, the first media reports of the wedding bear attack began appearing on local news outlets and social media platforms, though initial accounts contained significant inaccuracies due to limited information available during the ongoing emergency response activities. The unusual circumstances of a grizzly bear disrupting a formal wedding celebration captured public attention and created demand for detailed reporting that would persist for weeks following the incident. The media coverage of the incident raised important questions about wildlife management policies, outdoor event safety protocols, and the responsibilities of various parties involved in planning celebrations in remote wilderness areas. The public discussion generated by the coverage would ultimately contribute to improved safety guidelines and emergency response procedures for outdoor events in wildlife habitat areas. Wildlife management authorities, recognizing the potential for sensationalized media coverage to create unrealistic public fears about bear behavior or inappropriate pressure for lethal management action, issued statements emphasizing that the incident resulted from exceptional circumstances rather than typical predator behavior. Dr. Amanda Foster's public communications stressed that Bear 411 had shown no aggression toward humans and had focused entirely on food sources rather than territorial or defensive behavior. The educational value of the incident extended beyond immediate safety concerns to include broader discussions about human-wildlife coexistence, the impacts of climate change and habitat modification on animal behavior, and the importance of professional expertise in managing complex conservation challenges. The successful non-lethal resolution of the crisis provided a positive example of effective wildlife management techniques that preserved both human safety and animal welfare. Emergency response officials used the incident as a case study for improving coordination protocols among multiple agencies dealing with wildlife emergencies in areas with significant human presence. The complexity of the situation had revealed both strengths and weaknesses in existing response procedures, providing valuable information for enhancing future emergency management capabilities in similar circumstances. At 9:30, as wedding guests settled into hotel accommodations in Jackson and began the process of making alternative travel arrangements, the initial shock of their experience was beginning to give way to more complex emotional responses that would characterize their long-term recovery from the traumatic encounter. Many participants reported difficulty sleeping, persistent anxiety about outdoor activities, and intrusive memories of specific moments during the bear encounter. The psychological impact of surviving a predator encounter while dressed in formal attire created unique trauma responses that combined wilderness survival stress with the emotional significance of wedding day expectations. Mental health professionals who would later work with affected individuals noted that the juxtaposition of celebration and mortal danger created particularly complex post-traumatic stress patterns that required specialized treatment approaches. Family support networks activated to provide emotional assistance and practical help to wedding guests dealing with the aftermath of their shared traumatic experience. The unusual circumstances created bonds among participants that extended normal social relationships, while the need for mutual support and understanding drew the group together in ways that would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. The bride and groom, staying in a suite at the Jackson Lake Lodge while making decisions about future wedding plans, spent their first night as a married couple in the eyes of their experience, if not their legal status, processing the reality that their relationship had been fundamentally tested and strengthened by surviving mortal danger together. Their wedding story would forever be unique among their social circle, creating a foundation narrative that emphasized partnership, survival, and the unpredictable nature of life's most important moments. Insurance claims, adjusters began preliminary assessments of the losses sustained by various parties affected by the bear encounter, including property damage at the lodge, destroyed catering equipment and supplies, cancelled vendor services, and potential liability claims from traumatized wedding guests. The unprecedented nature of the incident created challenges for determining coverage and compensation under standard insurance policies that had not contemplated wildlife-related disruptions of this magnitude. The financial impact of the incident extended beyond immediate property losses to include long-term effects on business operations, professional reputations, and industry practices related to outdoor event planning in wildlife habitat areas. Vendors who had lost equipment and supplies faced immediate cash flow challenges, while the lodge property required extensive repairs before it could safely accommodate future guests. At 10:45, wildlife management personnel completed their initial assessment of the lodge property and confirmed that Bear 411 had moved to a safe distance from human activity with no signs of attempting to return to the area. The successful resolution of the immediate crisis enabled emergency response teams to begin demobilization while maintaining monitoring protocols that would continue for several days to ensure the bears returned to normal behavior patterns. The incident response had required coordination among Wyoming Game and Fish Department wildlife specialists, Teton County Sheriff's Office personnel, Jackson Hole Fire Department Emergency Medical Services, and various support agencies, demonstrating both the complexity of managing wildlife emergencies and the effectiveness of established inter-agency cooperation protocols. The successful outcome validated existing emergency response procedures while identifying areas for improvement in future similar situations. Dr. Amanda Foster's preliminary incident report documented the timeline of events, the bears' behavior patterns throughout the encounter, the effectiveness of various intervention strategies, and recommendations for preventing similar incidents in the future. Her assessment emphasized that the outcome could have been far worse without the professionalism of emergency response personnel and the disciplined behavior of the wedding guests during the crisis. The incident would ultimately be classified as a successful example of human-wildlife conflict resolution that preserved both human safety and animal welfare, while providing valuable data about grizzly bear behavior under unusual circumstances. The documentation of Bear 411's methodical approach and focus on food sources rather than human interaction contributed important information to the scientific understanding of large predator decision-making in human-modified environments. The long-term monitoring of Bear 411 following the incident would continue for several months to assess any behavioral changes resulting from his successful feeding experience at the lodge property. Wildlife management authorities needed to ensure that the encounter had not created problematic associations between human structures and food resources that could lead to future conflicts requiring more aggressive intervention strategies. November 15, 2024, marked 1 month since the wedding bear attack that had transformed a carefully planned celebration into a survival story that captured national attention and generated ongoing discussions about wildlife management, outdoor event safety, and human-predator coexistence in rapidly developing wilderness areas. The anniversary provided an opportunity to assess the long-term impacts of the incident on all parties involved and to evaluate the effectiveness of changes implemented in response to lessons learned from the unprecedented encounter. Natalie Marie Peters Harrison and Michael James Harrison had held their rescheduled wedding ceremony on November 2, 2024, at the Denver Botanic Gardens, surrounded by family and friends who had shared their traumatic Wyoming experience. The indoor venue provided security and controlled conditions that enabled them to focus on celebration rather than survival, though their wedding story would forever begin with the account of facing a grizzly bear while dressed in formal attire. The couple's decision to include references to their bear encounter in their wedding vows reflected their recognition that the traumatic experience had fundamentally strengthened their relationship and provided them with a unique foundation story that emphasized partnership, survival, and the unpredictable nature of life's most important moments. Their marriage had been tested by mortal danger before it officially began, creating bonds that transcended normal relationship development patterns. The psychological recovery of wedding guests had varied significantly among individuals, with some participants developing lasting anxiety about outdoor activities, while others found their confidence increased by having survived a dangerous wildlife encounter. Mental health professionals working with affected individuals noted that the shared nature of the traumatic experience had created strong support networks among participants that facilitated healing and post-traumatic growth. Amanda Rose Thompson, Natalie's maid of honor and a pediatric nurse practitioner, had taken leave from her Dallas position to pursue wilderness medicine training at the University of Utah, describing her bear encounter experience as a catalyst for recognizing the importance of emergency medical skills in remote settings. Her career change represented one of several major life decisions that wedding guests attributed directly to their shared survival experience. The property damage at Rustic Ridge Lodge had been fully repaired by early November, with improvements that included upgraded exterior doors, reinforced food storage areas, and enhanced wildlife deterrent systems designed to prevent future incidents. Property manager David Chen had implemented new safety protocols that included mandatory wildlife awareness briefings for all guests and regular monitoring procedures during outdoor events that involved food preparation or service. Insurance settlements had ultimately covered most of the direct financial losses sustained by various parties, though disputes over coverage limits and liability issues had required mediation and legal intervention to resolve satisfactorily. The unprecedented nature of the incident had exposed gaps in standard insurance policies that led to industry-wide revisions of coverage language related to wildlife-related disruptions of commercial activities. Chef Isabella Rodriguez had used the media attention generated by the bear encounter to launch a new catering business specializing in wildlife-safe outdoor dining experiences that emphasized proper food storage, scent management, and emergency response planning. Her expertise gained from surviving the lodge incident had become a marketable specialty that distinguished her services in the competitive outdoor catering industry. Wyoming Game and Fish Department had incorporated lessons learned from the incident into revised protocols for managing human-bear conflicts in developed areas, including improved coordination procedures among response agencies and enhanced public education programs about wildlife safety in outdoor recreation settings. The successful non-lethal resolution of the lodge crisis had provided a positive example that influenced policy development throughout the Greater Yellowstone region. Bear 411 had been monitored continuously following the lodge incident and had shown no signs of seeking additional human-related feeding opportunities or investigating human structures. His behavior had returned to normal patterns of wild foraging and seasonal movement, suggesting that the lodge encounter had been an opportunistic response to exceptional circumstances rather than a behavioral change that created ongoing management concerns. The scientific value of the incident extended beyond immediate wildlife management applications to include contributions to research on large predator decision-making, human-wildlife conflict resolution, and the behavioral impacts of environmental stresses such as drought and food scarcity. Dr. Amanda Foster's detailed documentation of the encounter had been published in the Journal of Wildlife Management and had influenced research priorities throughout North America. Media coverage of the wedding bear attack had ultimately generated more positive than negative publicity for wildlife conservation efforts, emphasizing the successful non-lethal resolution of the crisis and the importance of professional expertise in managing complex human-predator interactions. The story had become a popular example of effective wildlife management that preserved both human safety and animal welfare under challenging circumstances. The incident had also contributed to improved safety guidelines for outdoor event planning in wildlife habitat areas, including requirements for wildlife risk assessments, emergency response planning, and coordination with local wildlife management authorities. Wedding planners and venue operators throughout the Mountain West had implemented new protocols based on lessons learned from the lodge encounter. Educational programs developed in response to the incident had reached thousands of outdoor recreation enthusiasts, providing practical information about bear safety, wildlife behavior, and emergency response procedures that could prevent future conflicts or reduce their severity when encounters did occur. The story's combination of dramatic circumstances and successful resolution made it an effective tool for communicating important safety messages to diverse audiences. The anniversary reflections of wedding guests revealed complex emotions about their shared experience, including gratitude for survival, pride in their collective composure during the crisis, and lasting bonds formed through shared trauma. Many participants described the encounter as a life-changing experience that had altered their perspectives on risk, nature, and the importance of relationships that could withstand extreme stress. Robert William Peters, father of the bride and organizer of the original celebration, had established a scholarship fund for wilderness medicine training in honor of the emergency response personnel who had ensured everyone's safety during the crisis. His recognition that careful planning could not eliminate all risks had led to increased appreciation for the professionals whose expertise enabled positive outcomes in dangerous situations. The long-term impacts of the wedding bear attack extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence wildlife management policies, outdoor recreation safety practices, and public understanding of human-predator coexistence in rapidly developing wilderness areas. The incident had become a case study in successful crisis management that preserved both human welfare and wildlife conservation objectives, while providing valuable lessons for preventing and managing similar future encounters. The next stories: Kodiak destroys fishing boat, 3 missing, October 3, 2025. The first light of October 3, 2025, painted the waters of Larsen Bay in shades of amber and crimson, the kind of dawn that should have promised a profitable day on the water. Captain Robert James Myers stood at the helm of the Sarah's Dream, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, watching the sun climb over the jagged peaks of Kodiak Island. At 53, Robert had spent more than half his life navigating these treacherous waters, following in the footsteps of his grandfather, Magnus Myers, who had first brought the family name to Alaska's commercial fishing industry in 1952. The Sarah's Dream was Robert's pride, a 28-foot Bayliner trophy that he'd purchased with his savings 12 years earlier, naming it after his daughter Sarah Elizabeth Myers, now 26 and working as a marine biologist in Anchorage. The vessel featured a deep V hull designed for stability in rough seas, twin Mercury 150 outboard engines, and enough deck space to handle the salmon runs that had made Robert's reputation among the Kodiak Island fishing fleet. Every piece of equipment aboard had been meticulously maintained, from the Furuno fish finder to the hydraulic downriggers that could handle lines at depths exceeding 200 feet. Thomas "Tom" Riley, 41 years old, emerged from the cabin carrying his own coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs. Tom had been working with Robert for 7 seasons, ever since his divorce from Margaret Riley had left him seeking a fresh start, away from his former life as a construction foreman in Fairbanks. Standing 6 feet 2 inches, with graying brown hair and forearms marked by countless fishing line burns, Tom possessed an intuitive understanding of the sea that complemented Robert's technical expertise. His father, James Michael Riley, had been a crab fisherman who died in the Bering Sea when Tom was 16, a tragedy that had initially driven him away from maritime work, but ultimately pulled him back with an inexorable force. The third member of their crew, Victor Manuel Cruz, was the youngest at 28, born in Sitka, to a family with deep roots in Alaska's Latino fishing community. His grandfather, Eduardo Cruz, had migrated north from Monterey, California in the 1960s, establishing a successful fishing operation that Victor hoped to continue after learning the trade under Robert's experienced guidance. Victor possessed an uncanny ability to read weather patterns and fish behavior, skills that had already saved them from several potentially dangerous situations during his 2 years aboard the Sarah's Dream. As the sun climbed higher, transforming the water from deep purple to brilliant blue-green, Robert reviewed their planned route on the chart table below deck. They intended to work the waters approximately 12 nautical miles southwest of Larsen Bay, an area where Robert's fish finder had detected promising schools of silver salmon during their previous outing 4 days earlier. The National Weather Service forecast called for winds from the southeast at 10 to 15 knots, with seas running 2 to 3 feet and a chance of scattered showers developing by late afternoon. Larsen Bay itself served as their home port, a small community of roughly 100 residents located on the western shore of Kodiak Island. The bay provided excellent protection from the worst weather, surrounded by steep hills covered in dense Sitka spruce and alder thickets. The community had grown around the fishing industry, with most residents either working directly in commercial fishing or supporting the fleet through boat maintenance, processing, and supply services. At precisely 6:30 a.m., Robert fired up the twin Mercury engines, their synchronized rumble echoing off the surrounding hills as diesel exhaust mixed with the salt-tinged morning air. Tom cast off the mooring lines while Victor secured the gear on deck, ensuring that rods, nets, and tackle boxes were properly fastened for the journey ahead. The Sarah's Dream pulled away from the dock with Robert maintaining a steady 8 knots as they navigated the protected waters of the bay. The transit to their fishing grounds required approximately 90 minutes, during which the crew fell into their familiar pre-fishing routine. Tom prepared the downrigger systems, attaching lead weights to steel cables while checking the electrical connections that powered the hydraulic mechanisms. Victor organized their tackle selection, choosing spoons and hoochies in silver and blue patterns that had proven effective for silver salmon in recent weeks. Robert monitored the navigation systems, tracking their course on both GPS and traditional compass bearings, while keeping a vigilant eye on marine traffic and weather conditions. As they cleared the protected waters of Larsen Bay and entered the more exposed Gulf of Alaska, the sea state increased noticeably. The Sarah's Dream began to encounter swells running 4 to 5 feet from the southwest, remnants of a storm system that had passed through the region 3 days earlier. Robert adjusted their heading slightly to take the swells at a more comfortable angle, reducing their speed to 7 knots to minimize the jarring impact as the bow cut through each wave crest. The marine radio crackled with chatter from other vessels in the fleet, captains sharing information about fish locations, weather observations, and navigation hazards. Robert recognized the voices of longtime colleagues, including Danny Paulson aboard the Alaskan Dawn, Maria Santos on the Pacific Hunter, and veteran Captain Bill Henderson running the Northern Pride. The fishing community of Kodiak Island operated as an extended family, with crews sharing crucial information that could mean the difference between a successful day and returning to port empty-handed. At 8:15 a.m., Robert's Furuno fish finder began displaying the distinctive arching signatures that indicated schools of salmon approximately 160 feet below the surface. He throttled back the engines and called for Tom and Victor to prepare the fishing gear. The GPS coordinates showed their position as 57 degrees 23.8 minutes north, 154 degrees 17.2 minutes west, exactly the location where they had enjoyed success during their previous trip. Victor deployed the first downrigger line, watching the depth sounder as the lead weight descended through the water column. At 150 feet, he engaged the clutch mechanism and attached a silver spoon lure to the release clip. Tom followed with the second downrigger on the starboard side, choosing a blue and silver hoochie that had proven particularly effective earlier in the season. Robert maintained their position using the twin engines, making constant adjustments to keep the boat properly positioned over the fish while fighting the 4-foot swells and 15-knot winds. The first strike came within minutes, the downrigger rod bending deeply as something substantial took the lure. Tom grabbed the rod and began fighting what felt like a significant silver salmon, the fish making powerful runs that stripped line from the reel, despite the heavy drag setting. Victor prepared the landing net while Robert maneuvered the boat to assist with the fight, years of teamwork evident in their coordinated movements. After a 10-minute battle, Tom brought a bright silver salmon alongside the boat, its chrome sides flashing in the morning sunlight. Victor netted the fish expertly, a beautiful 14-pound silver that represented exactly the quality they hoped to find in this location. The fish went into the insulated hold with ice, the first of what they anticipated would be many similar specimens throughout the day. Over the next 2 hours, the fishing exceeded their expectations. They landed 17 silver salmon, ranging from 8 to 16 pounds, along with 3 small king salmon that would fetch premium prices at the dock. The fish finder continued to show active schools beneath them, and the bite remained consistent as they worked methodically through their tackle selection. Robert felt the satisfaction that came with a successful fishing operation, the kind of day that reminded him why he had chosen this challenging but rewarding profession. At 10:45 a.m., Victor noticed something unusual on the horizon to the east. A disturbance in the water, too large and too purposeful to be debris or a seal. He pointed it out to Tom, who grabbed the binoculars and focused on the anomaly. Through the lenses, he could make out what appeared to be a massive brown shape moving through the water with surprising speed and determination. "Captain," Tom called to Robert, his voice carrying an edge of concern, "you need to look at this." Robert took the binoculars and trained them on the approaching object. What he saw defied his initial expectations and sent a chill through his experienced fisherman's instincts. Swimming directly toward their vessel was a Kodiak brown bear of extraordinary size, its massive head held high above the water as it powered through the swells with strokes that covered remarkable distances. Even at a range of approximately 800 yards, the bear's immense proportions were clearly visible. Kodiak brown bears, subspecies Ursus arctos middendorfi, represent the largest terrestrial carnivores in North America, with adult males capable of reaching weights exceeding 1,500 pounds. These magnificent predators inhabit only Kodiak Island and several adjacent islands in the Kodiak archipelago, where abundant salmon runs and berry crops have allowed them to achieve sizes that dwarf their mainland cousins. Despite their massive bulk, Kodiak bears are surprisingly capable swimmers, regularly crossing channels between islands and venturing into marine environments in pursuit of food sources. The bear, approaching the Sarah's Dream, appeared to be a mature male, its shoulder hump clearly visible even as it swam. Robert estimated its size at over 12 feet in length, with a weight that likely exceeded 1,400 pounds. Its fur appeared dark brown, almost chocolate-colored, and remained remarkably dry despite its aquatic environment, testament to the waterproof properties of its dense double coat. "What's it doing out here?" Victor asked, his voice tight with growing apprehension. Robert lowered the binoculars, his weathered face grave with concern. "Sometimes they swim between islands, but I've never seen one this far from shore. Must be 6 miles to the nearest land." The bear continued its approach, maintaining a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than random wandering. Its swimming technique demonstrated remarkable efficiency, with powerful strokes of its massive forepaws propelling it through the water while its hind legs provided additional thrust. Despite the 4-foot swells, the bear navigated the surface with apparent ease, its head occasionally disappearing beneath wave crests before emerging with clockwork regularity. Tom retrieved the marine radio microphone and switched to channel 16, the international distress and calling frequency. Any vessels in the vicinity of Larsen Bay, this is the Sarah's Dream. We have a large brown bear swimming toward our position, approximately 6 miles southwest of Larsen Bay. Request any information about unusual bear activity in the area. The radio remained silent for several moments before crackling to life with the voice of Captain Danny Paulson aboard the Alaskan Dawn. Sarah's Dream, this is the Alaskan Dawn. Confirm you said a swimming bear? Affirmative, Alaskan Dawn, large male Kodiak bear approaching from the east, appears to be swimming directly toward our vessel. A third voice joined the conversation, Captain Bill Henderson from the Northern Pride. We had a report yesterday from a sport fishing charter about aggressive bear behavior near Terror Bay. Fish and Wildlife Department issued a warning about a problem bear in that area. Robert felt his stomach tighten as the implications became clear. Terror Bay lay approximately 15 miles northeast of their current position, easily within swimming range for a determined Kodiak bear. If this was indeed the same animal that had exhibited aggressive behavior toward humans, their situation had suddenly become much more serious. The bear had closed the distance to approximately 400 yards, close enough that they could clearly observe its swimming technique without binoculars. Its massive head remained well above the surface, dark eyes fixed on their vessel with unmistakable intent. The bear's ears, though flattened against its skull for hydrodynamic efficiency, showed no signs of the defensive posturing typical of a frightened or confused animal. "We need to move," Robert announced, his hand already reaching for the engine controls. "Tom, get those lines up now. Victor, secure everything on deck." The crew sprang into action with the efficiency born of years working together in challenging conditions. Tom engaged the hydraulic winches to retrieve the downrigger weights, while Victor began securing loose gear and tackle boxes. The silver salmon they had landed earlier remained in the insulated hold, but their immediate priority focused on preparing the vessel for rapid departure. Robert engaged the twin Mercury engines and began to slowly pull away from their fishing location, maintaining a course that would take them southeast toward deeper water while avoiding any direct approach toward the swimming bear. The engines responded smoothly, pushing the Sarah's Dream through the swells at increasing speed as Robert gradually advanced the throttles. The bear's reaction was immediate and alarming. Rather than losing interest as the boat moved away, the massive predator adjusted its course to maintain an intercept heading. Its swimming speed increased noticeably, powerful strokes propelling it through the water with determined efficiency that closed the distance despite the boat's movement. "It's following us," Victor observed, his voice barely audible over the engine noise and wind. Robert pushed the throttles forward, increasing their speed to 15 knots, well above the comfortable cruising pace for the sea conditions. The Sarah's Dream. Deep V hull handled the increased speed reasonably well, though the boat began slamming harder into the wave faces as they accelerated through the swells. For several minutes it appeared that their increased speed would allow them to outpace the pursuing bear. The distance gradually increased to over 600 yards as they maintained their southeastern course. Tom and Victor completed securing the fishing gear, then took positions where they could monitor the bear's progress while maintaining handholds for stability. At 11:20 a.m., the situation changed dramatically. The bear, rather than continuing its direct pursuit, altered its course to an intercept angle that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of marine navigation principles. Instead of following directly behind the boat, it began swimming toward a point where their paths would converge, using the boat's predictable course to minimize the distance it needed to cover. "Smart son of a bitch," Robert muttered, recognizing the tactical adjustment. It's trying to cut us off. He immediately altered their heading 30 degrees to starboard, attempting to avoid the convergence point the bear had calculated. The course change required them to take the swells at a less favorable angle, causing the boat to roll more severely as they cut across the wave pattern. The twin engines strained against the increased resistance, their synchronized rumble rising to a higher pitch as Robert maintained their speed. The bear adjusted its course again, demonstrating an almost supernatural ability to predict their movements. Its swimming speed seemed to increase further, though Robert knew this was likely an illusion created by their changing perspective and the bear's more efficient intercept angle. At 11:35 a.m., with the bear now less than 300 yards away and clearly visible without optical aids, Robert made the decision that would ultimately determine their fate. Rather than continuing their attempts to outrun the pursuing predator, he chose to make a direct run for the nearest land, approximately 8 miles to the northeast. "Hold on!" he called to his crew as he spun the wheel hard to port, bringing the Sarah's Dream around to a northeasterly heading that would take them directly toward the southwestern shore of Kodiak Island. The course change required them to cross the wave pattern at nearly 90 degrees, subjecting the boat to severe rolling and pitching that made movement on deck extremely hazardous. The bear, apparently anticipating this maneuver, adjusted its course with remarkable precision. Its new heading intersected their path to shore at a point approximately 4 miles from their current position, where the water depth decreased to less than 100 feet over a rocky shelf that extended from the island's coastline. As they raced toward land, the crew of the Sarah's Dream could only watch in growing horror as the massive predator closed the distance with each passing minute. The bear's swimming endurance seemed limitless, its powerful strokes maintaining a pace that gradually eroded their lead despite the boat's mechanical advantage. At 11:50 a.m., with the bear now less than 100 yards behind them, Tom made another radio call on Channel 16. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is the fishing vessel Sarah's Dream. We are being pursued by an aggressive brown bear approximately 8 miles southwest of Larsen Bay. Request immediate assistance." The Coast Guard station in Kodiak responded within seconds. "Sarah's Dream, this is Coast Guard Kodiak. Confirm you are being pursued by a bear?" "Affirmative, Coast Guard. Large male Kodiak bear has been chasing us for over 20 minutes. We are making best speed toward shore, but the bear is gaining on us." "Sarah's Dream, understand you have a bear situation. We are launching rescue assets. Continue toward the nearest land and maintain radio contact." Behind them, the bear had closed to within 50 yards, close enough that they could clearly see its massive head rising and falling with each stroke, water cascading from its fur as it powered through the swells. Its dark eyes remained fixed on the boat with unwavering intensity, while its ears were now laid flat against its skull in an aggressive posture that veteran outdoorsmen would recognize as extremely dangerous. Robert pushed the engines to their maximum sustainable power, the twin Mercuries screaming as they fought against the increasing sea state and the boat's loaded condition. The Sarah's Dream was now making 22 knots through 4-foot swells, far beyond the safe operating parameters for the conditions, but their survival depended on maintaining every possible knot of speed. Victor, positioned at the stern, watched in fascination and terror as the bear continued its relentless pursuit. The animal's swimming technique remained remarkably efficient, despite what must have been over 30 minutes of continuous exertion. Its breathing was clearly labored now, visible as rhythmic exhalations that created small clouds of vapor in the cool October air, but its determination showed no signs of wavering. At 12:05 p.m., disaster struck with terrifying suddenness. The bear, now less than 20 yards behind the boat, suddenly accelerated with a burst of speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics and marine biology. Its massive forepaws churned the water into white foam as it closed the final distance in a matter of seconds. Tom, who had been monitoring their pursuer from the port quarter, shouted a warning just as the bear reached the stern of the Sarah's Dream. With a display of power that would haunt the survivors' nightmares for years to come, the 1,500-pound Predator launched itself partially out of the water and managed to get both front paws over the boat's transom. The impact was catastrophic. The bear's weight, combined with the leverage created by its position at the stern, immediately altered the boat's trim and stability. Robert felt the wheel jerk in his hands as the stern settled deeper into the water while the bow rose at a dangerous angle. "Get it off! Get it off!" Victor screamed, grabbing a gaff hook and attempting to strike at the bear's massive forepaws. The hook bounced harmlessly off the animal's thick fur and muscle, serving only to increase its agitation. The bear, now with secure purchase on the boat's transom, began the process of hauling its massive bulk aboard the Sarah's Dream. Its hind legs, still in the water, kicked powerfully as it used the boat itself as leverage to complete its boarding. The 28-foot vessel, designed to handle the weight of fish and equipment, was never intended to support the dynamic load of a struggling 1,500-pound Predator. Tom grabbed the emergency flare gun from its bracket near the helm, his hands shaking as he tried to load a cartridge while the boat pitched violently under the bear's assault. The flare gun represented their only weapon capable of potentially deterring the massive Predator, though its effectiveness against an animal of this size and determination remained questionable. The bear's head and shoulders were now completely aboard the boat, its massive forepaws gripping the deck while its powerful hindquarters continued to kick against the transom. Water poured over the stern as the boat's stability reached critical limits, and Robert realized with growing horror that they were in imminent danger of capsizing. At 12:08 p.m., the inevitable occurred. The bear managed to get its right hind leg over the transom, bringing approximately 2/3 of its massive weight aboard the Sarah's Dream. The sudden shift in the boat's center of gravity, combined with the dynamic forces created by the animal's movements, exceeded the vessel's stability limits. The Sarah's Dream rolled hard to port, throwing all 3 crew members across the deck as tons of seawater poured over the starboard rail. The bear, now essentially aboard but struggling to maintain its footing on the slippery fiberglass deck, became even more agitated as it fought to stabilize itself on the tilting platform. Robert, thrown against the port rail by the boat's violent motion, managed to grab the radio microphone one final time. "Mayday! Mayday! Sarah's Dream is capsizing. Bear is on the boat. We're going over." The response from Coast Guard Kodiak was immediate, but would prove tragically irrelevant. "Sarah's Dream, we have assets en route. Maintain life jackets and prepare to abandon ship." Tom, still clutching the flare gun, managed to fire a single red flare toward the bear as the boat continued its death roll. The flare struck the animal in the shoulder, producing a shower of red sparks and a cloud of acrid smoke, but failing to drive the massive Predator back into the water. Instead, the bear's agitation increased further, its powerful claws scoring deep gouges in the fiberglass deck as it fought for purchase. At 12:10 p.m., the Sarah's Dream reached the point of no return. The massive bear, now fully aboard but unable to maintain stability on the tilting deck, threw the vessel's balance beyond any possibility of recovery. With a grinding roar of stressed fiberglass and aluminum, the 28-foot fishing boat rolled completely over, trapping all 4 occupants beneath its overturned hull. The water temperature in this part of the Gulf of Alaska measured 46 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to incapacitate an unprotected human within 15 to 20 minutes. Robert Myers, Tom Riley, and Victor Cruz found themselves trapped beneath their overturned vessel in a pocket of air that would sustain them for only minutes before the inexorable rise of seawater claimed their remaining breathing space. The Bear, despite its massive size and dense fur, faced similar challenges in the frigid water. Kodiak brown bears, while capable swimmers, are not marine mammals and lack the specialized adaptations that would allow them to survive indefinitely in 46-degree seawater. The animal's thick fur provided some insulation, but its enormous body mass created heat loss through convection and conduction that would prove ultimately unsustainable. In the darkness beneath the overturned hull, the three crew members struggled against disorientation and rising panic. The pocket of trapped air measured perhaps 6 feet by 3 feet, barely sufficient to accommodate their heads and shoulders while they fought to stay afloat in their life jackets. The water continued to rise as air escaped through various openings in the hull, giving them perhaps 5 minutes before their breathing space would be completely flooded. Robert, his voice barely audible above the sound of sloshing water and groaning fiberglass, attempted to maintain crew discipline in their desperate situation. "Stay calm. Coast Guard knows our position. They'll have boats here soon." But even as he spoke the words, Robert understood their grim reality. The nearest Coast Guard assets were based in Kodiak, over 30 miles away. Even traveling at maximum speed, rescue vessels would require at least 45 minutes to reach their position, far longer than their air pocket would sustain them. Tom Riley, veteran of countless dangerous situations both on land and sea, fought against the claustrophobic panic that threatened to overwhelm his rational thinking. The water had risen to their chins, forcing them to tilt their heads back to keep their mouths and noses above the surface. His experience as a construction worker had prepared him for hazardous conditions, but nothing in his background had equipped him for being trapped beneath an overturned boat in frigid seawater. Victor Cruz, youngest and strongest of the three, began exploring their confined space with his hands, searching for any opening large enough to allow escape. His fingers traced the familiar contours of equipment and fixtures now positioned overhead, while he fought against the disorientation created by their inverted world. The emergency locator beacon, mounted near the helm, should have activated automatically when it contacted seawater, sending a distress signal that would guide rescue efforts to their exact location. Outside their air pocket prison, the 1,500-pound Kodiak bear faced its own struggle for survival. The animal's dense fur, while providing excellent insulation in terrestrial environments, became a liability in the marine setting. Waterlogged fur lost much of its insulating properties while adding significant weight that increased the energy expenditure required for swimming. The bear, driven by instincts honed over millennia of evolution, began swimming toward the nearest land. Its massive forepaws, each larger than a dinner plate and equipped with claws exceeding 4 inches in length, propelled it through the 4-foot swells with determination born of desperation. The animal's earlier aggression had been replaced by simple survival needs as it faced the same hypothermic challenges that threatened the human crew. At 12:15 p.m., the air pocket beneath the Sarah's Dream's hull reached critical limits. The water level had risen to the point where the 3 men could only breathe by pressing their faces against small gaps in the overhead structure. Robert made the decision that defined true maritime leadership. Rather than waiting for their air supply to be exhausted, they would attempt escape while they still possessed the strength and mental clarity necessary for survival. "We go together," he announced, his voice distorted by their cramped positioning. "Take the deepest breath you can. Swim down and out from under the boat, then up. Stay together." The plan, while simple in concept, required precise execution under conditions that challenged human endurance and psychological resilience. They would need to swim approximately 15 feet underwater, navigate clear of the overturned hull, and surface while fighting the effects of 46-degree water on their motor functions and decision-making abilities. Tom Riley volunteered to go first, his construction background having provided experience with confined space emergencies. He hyperventilated briefly to saturate his blood with oxygen, then took the deepest breath possible and disappeared beneath the rising waterline. His powerful kicks carried him down and away from the boat's hull, while his hands groped through the murky water to maintain orientation in the chaotic underwater environment. After what seemed like an eternity, but measured perhaps 30 seconds, Tom's head broke the surface 20 feet from the overturned Sarah's Dream. He immediately began treading water while calling for his companions, his voice already showing the effects of cold water exposure. The 4-foot swells repeatedly washed over his head, forcing him to time his breathing with the wave pattern while fighting against the body's natural panic response to frigid immersion. Victor followed next, his younger physiology providing slight advantages in breath-holding capacity and cold water tolerance. His underwater navigation proved more efficient than Tom's, bringing him to the surface approximately 15 feet from the boat's hull. However, the combination of adrenaline, cold shock, and physical exertion had begun to affect his coordination and judgment. Robert Myers, as captain, ensured his crew's safety before attempting his own escape. When Victor's head appeared above water, Robert took his final breath of increasingly stale air and dove beneath the waterline. His 53-year-old body, while hardened by decades of physical work, responded less efficiently to the extreme demands of cold water survival. The current created by wind and waves had begun to separate the three men, despite their attempts to stay together. Tom, first to escape and therefore most affected by cold water exposure, found his swimming ability rapidly diminishing as his core body temperature dropped. The heavy work clothes that provided protection in normal fishing operations now became waterlogged anchors that increased his struggle to remain afloat. Victor, fighting against the early stages of hypothermia, managed to swim closer to Tom's position. Their life jackets provided crucial buoyancy, but the combination of wind, waves, and frigid water made coordinated movement increasingly difficult. They could see Robert's head bobbing in the swells approximately 30 yards away, but the distance might as well have been 30 miles, given their rapidly diminishing capabilities. At 12:22 p.m., approximately 12 minutes after the Sarah's Dream capsized, the first symptoms of severe hypothermia began affecting all three survivors. Tom Riley, longest in the water, experienced the most advanced progression: violent shivering, disorientation, and loss of fine motor control. His speech became slurred as he attempted to call out to his companions, while his movements grew increasingly uncoordinated. The physiological effects of cold water immersion follow predictable patterns that have claimed countless lives in Alaska's waters. Initial cold shock causes involuntary gasping and hyperventilation, often leading to aspiration of seawater. This is followed by peripheral vasoconstriction as the body attempts to preserve core temperature, reducing blood flow to extremities and dramatically impairing swimming ability. Finally, hypothermia affects mental function, leading to confusion, poor judgment, and eventual loss of consciousness. Victor Cruz, despite his youth and fitness, showed similar symptoms as his core temperature dropped toward critical levels. His powerful swimming strokes became increasingly feeble, while his ability to coordinate breathing with wave action diminished rapidly. The heavy clothing that had seemed appropriate for October fishing conditions now threatened his survival as waterlogged fabric dragged him deeper into the frigid embrace of the Gulf of Alaska. Captain Robert Myers, separated from his crew by wind and current, fought his own losing battle against hypothermia and exhaustion. His years of experience provided psychological advantages in dealing with maritime emergencies, but his aging physiology responded less efficiently to extreme cold exposure. His movements became increasingly sluggish as his body diverted blood flow away from peripheral muscles in a desperate attempt to maintain core temperature. The overturned hull of the Sarah's Dream drifted slowly eastward under the influence of wind and current, its white fiberglass bottom serving as a highly visible marker for rescue aircraft. The emergency locator beacon continued transmitting its distinctive distress signal, providing precise coordinates to Coast Guard rescue assets that we were still 30 minutes away from the disaster site. At 12:28 p.m., Tom Riley's condition reached critical stages. His violent shivering had ceased, replaced by the ominous stillness that indicates the body's inability to generate heat through muscular activity. His life jacket kept him afloat, but his consciousness began to fade as his core temperature dropped below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the threshold where hypothermia becomes immediately life-threatening. Victor, swimming with desperate determination toward Tom's position, managed to reach his companion just as the older man's head began to slip beneath the surface. Using techniques learned during mandatory Coast Guard safety training, Victor attempted to maintain Tom's airway while keeping both of them afloat in the increasingly challenging sea conditions. The effort required to support Tom's dead weight proved catastrophic to Victor's own survival prospects. The additional energy expenditure accelerated his heat loss, while his compromised motor skills made it increasingly difficult to maintain proper positioning relative to the wave action. Within minutes, both men were fighting for their lives as hypothermia claimed their remaining strength and coordination. Robert Myers, isolated from his crew and facing his own mortality, made the decision that would define his final moments. Rather than attempting to swim toward his companions, he chose to conserve his remaining energy while staying as close as possible to the overturned boat. His maritime experience suggested that rescue aircraft would focus their initial search efforts around the vessel's last known position, making proximity to the wreckage his best chance for survival. The decision proved tactically sound, but ultimately irrelevant. Robert's advancing hypothermia, combined with the cumulative effects of cold water exposure, physical exertion, and psychological stress, pushed his physiological systems beyond their limits. His life jacket maintained his buoyancy, but his consciousness faded as his core temperature dropped toward levels incompatible with human survival. At 12:35 p.m., approximately 25 minutes after the Sarah's Dream capsized, Coast Guard rescue helicopter 6560 arrived on scene. The aircraft, a Eurocopter MH-65 Dolphin based at Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak, had launched immediately upon receiving the vessel's Mayday transmission and had covered the 30-mile distance in record time. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, aircraft commander with over 15 years of Coast Guard experience, immediately began coordinating rescue operations from her position in the left seat. Her crew included Lieutenant James Patterson as co-pilot, aviation survival technician second class Maria Santos as rescue swimmer, and aviation maintenance technician first class David Kim operating the rescue hoist. The scene that greeted the rescue crew defied their extensive training and experience. The overturned hull of the Sarah's Dream floated approximately 200 yards from three widely separated figures in the water, all appearing motionless despite the Coast Guard helicopter's arrival. The sea state had increased to 5-foot swells with whitecaps, creating challenging conditions for rescue operations. Maria Santos, a veteran rescue swimmer with over 200 successful missions, donned her survival suit and prepared for deployment into the frigid water. Her equipment included a hypothermia treatment kit, emergency oxygen, and specialized flotation devices designed for multiple victim scenarios. The water temperature readings transmitted by the helicopter's sensors showed 45 degrees Fahrenheit, conditions that would challenge even her extensive cold water training. The first victim they approached was Captain Robert Myers, floating approximately 50 yards northeast of the overturned vessel. Santos deployed from the helicopter and swam to his position within 2 minutes, immediately recognizing the advanced stages of hypothermia from his blue-tinged skin, absent shivering response, and minimal consciousness level. She attached him to the rescue basket and signaled for immediate hoist to the aircraft. Robert's condition upon reaching the helicopter was critical but not hopeless. His core body temperature, measured by rectal thermometer, registered 86 degrees Fahrenheit, well into the severe hypothermia range, but still potentially survivable with aggressive medical intervention. Aviation maintenance technician Kim began warming protocols while Lieutenant Commander Mitchell coordinated emergency medical evacuation to Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center. The second rescue attempt focused on Tom Riley and Victor Cruz, whose positions had been reported by Santos during her initial assessment. The two men were found floating within 20 feet of each other, both unconscious and showing no response to external stimuli. Their life jackets had maintained flotation, but their skin color and lack of movement suggested advanced hypothermia progression. Santos deployed again, this time with additional flotation equipment designed to handle multiple victims. The rescue operation required exceptional skill as she maneuvered both men into position for sequential hoist operations while fighting 5-foot swells and deteriorating weather conditions. Tom Riley was lifted first, followed by Victor Cruz, both requiring immediate advanced life support interventions. Tom's condition proved more serious than Robert's, with a core temperature of 83 degrees Fahrenheit and no detectable heartbeat using the aircraft's medical monitoring equipment. Aviation maintenance technician Kim began cardiopulmonary resuscitation while applying warming blankets and heated oxygen therapy. The adage, "They're not dead until they're warm and dead," guided their treatment protocols, maintaining resuscitation efforts despite the apparent futility. Victor Cruz presented the most challenging medical situation. At 28 years old, his physiology should have provided better cold water survival characteristics, but his core temperature measured only 81 degrees Fahrenheit with no detectable vital signs. The prolonged immersion combined with his efforts to rescue Tom Riley had accelerated his heat loss beyond survivable limits. The helicopter crew maintained aggressive treatment protocols for all 3 victims during their flight to Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center. The 15-minute flight time provided crucial opportunities for rewarming and life support interventions that might prove decisive in determining survival outcomes. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell maintained radio contact with the hospital's emergency department, providing detailed medical information that allowed preparation of specialized hypothermia treatment protocols. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, Emergency Department Director at Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center, had assembled a full trauma team upon receiving notification of the incoming hypothermia victims. Her experience treating cold water casualties throughout 15 years of Alaska emergency medicine provided the expertise necessary for managing such extreme cases. The hospital's hypothermia protocols included extracorporeal rewarming capabilities that represented the most advanced treatment options available in the region. At 1:05 p.m., Coast Guard Helicopter 6560 landed at the hospital's helipad, beginning the critical transition from rescue to medical treatment. Robert Myers, semi-conscious and responsive to verbal stimuli, was immediately transported to the emergency department's trauma room, where active rewarming procedures began. His survival prospects appeared favorable given his relatively stable condition and core temperature above the critical threshold. Tom Riley's condition required immediate advanced life support interventions, including mechanical ventilation and aggressive rewarming protocols. His absence of detectable vital signs complicated treatment decisions, but Dr. Rodriguez elected to pursue full resuscitation efforts, including extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, if necessary. The procedure, while risky, offered the only realistic chance of survival for victims of severe accidental hypothermia. Victor Cruz's treatment began with the understanding that his survival was highly unlikely given his extremely low core temperature and prolonged cardiac arrest. However, medical protocols required continued resuscitation efforts until rewarming could be achieved. Following established guidelines that hypothermia victims should not be declared deceased until normal body temperature has been restored, the medical team's efforts over the following 6 hours represented the pinnacle of modern hypothermia treatment. Robert Myers responded well to warming protocols, achieving normal body temperature within 4 hours and demonstrating stable vital signs throughout the process. His survival appeared certain barring complications from secondary injuries or aspiration pneumonia. Tom Riley's case proved more challenging, requiring extracorporeal rewarming to achieve return of spontaneous circulation. His heart resumed beating after 5 hours of continuous life support, though significant neurological damage remained a concern due to prolonged hypoxic exposure. His survival, while possible, would likely involve extensive rehabilitation and permanent disability. Victor Cruz, despite heroic medical efforts extending over 8 hours, never achieved return of spontaneous circulation. His core temperature was successfully restored to normal levels, but the combination of severe hypothermia and prolonged cardiac arrest had caused irreversible damage. Dr. Rodriguez pronounced his death at 9:23 p.m., making him the first confirmed fatality of the Sarah's Dream disaster. The search for the massive Kodiak bear that had precipitated the tragedy continued throughout the afternoon and evening hours. Coast Guard aircraft conducting expanding square searches found no trace of the animal, though wildlife biologists noted that a bear of such size could potentially survive for several hours in 45-degree water if it successfully reached land. Alaska Department of Fish and Game personnel, led by regional wildlife biologist Dr. Michael Thompson, initiated comprehensive investigations into the incident. Dr. Thompson, holder of a Ph.D. in wildlife biology from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and author of extensive research on Kodiak bear behavior, had never encountered a case of such extreme aggressive behavior toward marine vessels. Initial theories focused on the bear's possible connection to the problem animal reported near Terror Bay 2 days earlier. If the same individual had been involved in both incidents, its behavior suggested either rabies infection, severe injury causing disorientation, or possible brain trauma affecting normal behavioral patterns. Each possibility carried significant implications for public safety and wildlife management protocols. The investigation required coordination between multiple agencies, including the Coast Guard, Alaska State Troopers, Fish and Game Department, and National Transportation Safety Board. While maritime casualties involving wildlife were rare, the potential for similar incidents required comprehensive analysis to prevent future tragedies. Coast Guard investigator Lieutenant Sarah Coleman, assigned to determine the proximate cause of the Sarah's Dream's loss, faced unprecedented challenges in reconstructing events. Surviving crew member Robert Myers while conscious and able to communicate, remained in critical condition with hypothermia-induced complications that limited his ability to provide detailed testimony. The physical evidence recovered from the disaster site included portions of the vessel's hull showing distinctive claw marks consistent with a large bear's attack. Marine biologist Dr. Jennifer Walsh consultant to the investigation team, confirmed that the scoring patterns matched known Kodiak bear claw configurations and demonstrated extraordinary force application. Radio transcripts recovered from Coast Guard communications provided detailed timeline information documenting the progression from initial bear sighting through final Mayday transmission. The recordings revealed the crew's professional response to an unprecedented emergency situation, with Captain Myers maintaining proper communication protocols throughout the crisis. Analysis of the vessel's emergency locator beacon data confirmed the precise timeline of events, with activation occurring at 12:10 p.m., coinciding with the capsizing incident. The beacon's GPS coordinates provided exact location information that proved crucial for rescue operations and subsequent investigation efforts. Weather data from National Weather Service stations confirmed favorable conditions at the time of the incident, with winds from the southeast at 12 knots and seas running 4 to 5 feet. The conditions, while slightly rough, fell well within normal operating parameters for vessels of the Sarah's Dream's size and design specifications. Dr. Thompson's behavioral analysis of the bear's actions revealed several disturbing patterns that challenged conventional understanding of Kodiak bear psychology. The animal's sustained pursuit over approximately 40 minutes, combined with its tactical swimming approach and determination to board the vessel, suggested either extreme desperation or abnormal brain function. Toxicology testing of fish samples recovered from the Sarah's Dream's hold revealed no unusual contamination that might have attracted aggressive bear behavior. The silver salmon showed normal tissue composition and no evidence of disease conditions that could explain the bear's extreme interest in the vessel. The investigation's preliminary findings, released 3 weeks after the incident, identified the cause of the tragedy as catastrophic stability loss due to extraordinary wildlife interaction. The report acknowledged that no amount of crew training or vessel modification could have prevented the disaster given the unprecedented nature of the bear's behavior. Captain Robert Myers survived his hypothermia ordeal, but required extensive hospitalization for treatment of cold-related injuries, including severe frostbite, affecting his hands and feet. His recovery process extended over 3 months, during which he provided detailed testimony to investigators while undergoing physical rehabilitation and psychological counseling. Tom Riley's survival came at tremendous cost, with permanent neurological damage affecting his motor coordination and short-term memory function. His injuries prevented return to commercial fishing, requiring long-term disability support and ongoing medical care. The man who had worked Alaska's waters for over 2 decades would never again feel comfortable near the ocean that had nearly claimed his life. The loss of Victor Cruz devastated the tight-knit fishing community of Larsen Bay, where his family had operated for 3 generations. His funeral, attended by over 500 people from throughout the Kodiak Island region, served as a somber reminder of the risks faced by those who make their living from Alaska's dangerous waters. The search for the bear responsible for the attack continued for several weeks, with fish and game personnel using aircraft and ground teams to cover potential landing sites throughout the southwestern Kodiak Island region. Despite extensive efforts, no trace of the massive animal was ever discovered, leading to speculation about its ultimate fate. Dr. Thompson's final report on the bear's behavior included recommendations for enhanced monitoring of problem wildlife in marine environments. The incident highlighted gaps in understanding about Kodiak bear swimming capabilities and the potential for aggressive encounters in offshore waters previously considered safe from such threats. Commercial fishing operations in the Larsen Bay area resumed gradually, with many captains implementing new safety protocols, including enhanced radio communications, additional flotation equipment, and wildlife deterrent devices. The fishing industry's response demonstrated both resilience and recognition that Alaska's maritime environment contained dangers that defied conventional preparation. The insurance settlement for the Sarah's Dream's total loss required extensive legal proceedings due to the unprecedented nature of the casualty. Maritime insurance policies typically excluded losses due to acts of God or perils of the sea, but wildlife attacks fell into undefined territory, requiring careful legal interpretation. Media coverage of the tragedy brought international attention to the power and unpredictability of Alaska's brown bear population. Documentary crews from major television networks traveled to Kodiak Island, seeking interviews with survivors and wildlife experts, though many sensationalized accounts failed to capture the true complexity of human-wildlife interactions in Alaska's marine environment. The Coast Guard's rescue response received widespread praise for the professional execution under extremely challenging conditions. Aviation survival technician Maria Santos was awarded the Coast Guard Medal for her heroic rescue swimming operations that saved 2 lives under conditions that challenged the limits of human endurance. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell's aircraft crew received unit commendations for their collective performance during the rescue operation. The successful recovery of 3 hypothermia victims from 5-foot seas demonstrated the exceptional training and equipment capabilities that make Coast Guard rescue operations possible in Alaska's unforgiving environment. Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center's emergency department staff, led by Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, implemented revised hypothermia treatment protocols based on lessons learned from treating the Sarah's Dream survivors. The hospital's experience with extreme cold water casualties provided valuable medical knowledge that would benefit future victims of similar accidents. The fishing vessel Sarah's Dream was declared a constructive total loss, with her overturned hull eventually washing ashore near Cape Chiniak approximately 2 months after the incident. Salvage operations recovered personal effects and equipment, but the vessel's remains served as a stark reminder of the sea's power to claim even well-prepared mariners. Robert Meyer's recovery included extensive psychological counseling to address post-traumatic stress symptoms related to the attack and survival experience. His therapist, Dr. Linda Patterson, specialized in treating survivors of wilderness accidents and helped him process the complex emotions surrounding his crew members' fate. The captain's guilt over surviving while Victor Cruz died proved particularly challenging to address. Survivor's guilt represents a common psychological response to traumatic incidents, but Robert's case was complicated by his command responsibility and the impossible decisions forced upon him during the emergency. Tom Riley's rehabilitation required relearning basic motor skills affected by his hypothermia-induced neurological damage. Physical therapists worked with him for months to restore coordination and balance, though full recovery remained uncertain. His case highlighted the long-term consequences that could result from cold water survival situations. The economic impact of Victor Cruz's death extended beyond personal tragedy to affect the broader fishing community. His family's fishing operation, dependent on his labor and expertise, struggled to continue without his contributions. Community support helped maintain the business during the transition period, but long-term viability remained questionable. Alaska Department of Fish and Game officials implemented enhanced bear monitoring protocols in response to the Sarah's Dream incident. Additional resources were allocated to tracking problem bears and developing improved methods for preventing human-wildlife conflicts in marine environments. The investigation's final report, released 6 months after the incident, concluded that no regulatory changes were necessary as the tragedy resulted from extraordinary circumstances that could not reasonably have been anticipated or prevented through normal safety measures. However, recommendations were made for improved wildlife encounter training for commercial fishermen. Coast Guard officials reviewed rescue response procedures and confirmed that existing protocols had functioned effectively during the emergency. The rapid deployment of rescue assets and successful recovery of survivors demonstrated the system's capability to respond to unusual maritime emergencies. The scientific community's interest in the incident led to expanded research into Kodiak bear swimming behavior and marine habitat utilization. Dr. Thompson's work, funded by federal wildlife research grants, aimed to better understand the circumstances that could lead to aggressive bear encounters in offshore waters. Maritime historians noted that the Sarah's Dream incident represented the first recorded case of a fishing vessel being attacked and sunk by a bear in Alaska's waters. While bears had occasionally been observed swimming between islands, aggressive interaction with vessels had never been documented to this extent. The psychological impact on Alaska's fishing fleet proved significant, with many captains reporting increased anxiety when working in areas known to have bear populations. Some operators invested in bear spray and other deterrent devices, though their effectiveness against swimming bears remained largely theoretical. Educational initiatives developed by the Alaska Marine Safety Education Association included the Sarah's Dream incident in their curriculum for commercial fishing safety training. The tragedy served as a powerful reminder that Alaska's maritime environment contained unique hazards requiring constant vigilance and preparation. The bear responsible for the attack was never conclusively identified or located, despite extensive search efforts by wildlife authorities. Speculation about its fate included theories ranging from successful escape to shore to death from hypothermia during its attempted swim to land. Weather patterns in the weeks following the incident brought early winter conditions to the Kodiak Island region, effectively ending the search for the bear. Snow and ice formation made ground-based tracking impossible, while reduced daylight hours limited aircraft operations. The anniversary of the Sarah's Dream disaster became an annual observance for Larsen Bay's fishing community, honoring Victor Cruz's memory while celebrating the survival of Robert Myers and Tom Riley. The somber ceremony served as a reminder of the risks accepted by those who choose to make their living from Alaska's dangerous waters. Dr. Rodriguez published medical papers detailing the hypothermia treatment protocols used during the emergency, contributing valuable knowledge to the field of cold water survival medicine. Her work emphasized the importance of rapid rewarming and aggressive life support measures in treating severe accidental hypothermia cases. The Coast Guard's official accident report became required reading at the Coast Guard Academy, where it was incorporated into rescue operations curriculum. Future rescue swimmers and flight crews studied the case as an example of successful multi-victim recovery under extreme conditions. Maritime insurance companies began including specific wildlife attack provisions in their policies, recognizing that climate change and habitat disruption might increase the frequency of such unusual incidents. The Sarah's Dream case established legal precedents for handling claims involving unprecedented natural phenomena. Robert Myers eventually returned to limited fishing operations, though he never again worked the waters where the attack occurred. His new vessel, the Second Chance, incorporated enhanced safety equipment, including satellite communications and additional flotation devices based on lessons learned from his survival experience. Tom Riley's disability prevented his return to commercial fishing, but he found work with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as a safety consultant, sharing his experience with other mariners. His first-hand knowledge of cold water survival proved valuable in developing improved safety protocols. The fishing grounds where the Sarah's Dream was attacked remained productive, with other vessels working the area without incident throughout subsequent seasons. However, captains reported increased vigilance and enhanced radio communications when operating in those waters. Scientific interest in the incident continued for years, with researchers studying the behavioral patterns that might lead to such aggressive bear-human interactions. The rarity of the event made definitive conclusions difficult, but the case contributed to broader understanding of wildlife behavior in marine environments. The legacy of the Sarah's Dream disaster extended far beyond the immediate tragedy, influencing safety protocols, rescue procedures, and wildlife management practices throughout Alaska's maritime region. The incident served as a stark reminder that even experienced mariners operating well-equipped vessels could face dangers that challenged the limits of human preparedness and survival capability. In the end, the story of Kodiak Destroys Fishing Boat, 3 missing, represented more than a simple wildlife encounter gone wrong. It embodied the eternal struggle between human ambition and nature's raw power, played out in one of the world's most unforgiving environments where a moment's inattention or an unprecedented threat could transform routine operations into life-or-death struggles against overwhelming odds.